order, and we'll start with the Pledge of Allegiance. Pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic which stands one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. All right, thank you. Do we have anybody online, Mr. Graham? Okay, so we have roll call. We'll jump into residents' request to address the board, and there are none tonight. So we're going to jump into the finance presentations, and we're going to start with the Lancaster, Lebanon IU. Mrs. Hall, are you ready for that yet, or are we moving too fast? Okay.
Mr. Maris has anything to add as part of the IU board. What they're proposing is a 2.2% increase to their core program services and a 1.95 to their instructional media services. I don't know if you have additional.
No, I think they reviewed that budget a month ago, and I think it's reasonable. They kept that pretty flat.
Yeah.
So.
I'm sorry, I'm not seeing that presentation in the folder.
It's in board docs, it's there.
Yep.
There should be multiple documents. One is a highlights.
Mr. Maris, you're recommending then?
Yes, I think that's a reasonable, and they normally keep that really flat. A couple percent this year. I don't think it's unreasonable to ask. They do a lot of good things for us and others.
Any other comments or questions about the IU budget?
So what would our change in contribution be?
Does that change our contribution? That was built in, correct?
That is, there's two parts of the budget, and we actually, the school districts only contribute to the instructional media services. So they're proposing, I have here at 2%. The core program services, there's no direct assessment to local districts. It's just the instructional media services. So.
I'm sorry, Mr. Maris,
I'm sorry.
2%.
I'm usually loud enough, but I guess you can't hear me.
2%.
And that's what
It's
we.
2%.
Yeah, it says 2% in the document, so I was wrong. There is a 2%, but that's approximately an increase of $25,000. So if I'm correct, it's 2% of 25,000? Am I reading that right?
I don't have our exact contribution. I have, I think I have the total amount for all the districts, but I don't know what that breakdown is. From year to year, I think they've kept it flat. I think last year, a number of years, they've kept it flat with no increase. This year is a 2%, which considering inflation, all different things facing everyone. I don't think-
We would be going up about $1,000.
Yeah, so it is about 2% of that amount, the 25. I guess it's not 2%.
It's based on usage at times. And
Okay.
so on page 14 of 17, in the general operating budget proposal, it lists the districts and then the estimated increase for each of the districts. And if you look from the prior year actual of 23-24, it was 62,298, and we're looking at 63,251. So it's about.
Yep, I see it.
Yep.
I recommend we approve it.
So it will be on the April board meeting for approval.
Okay. Gotcha.
All right, any other questions before we move on? Regarding the IU? All right, hearing none, we're going to go into the budget update. Mrs. Hall, I'll let you take it away.
Great. Next slide. So since our last meeting, we've done some work on the budget here. You'll see both the revenues and expenditures have changed in terms of the revenues. We have additional transportation subsidy. We added in our PCCD funds, our ESSER funds, and we've updated the PSERS and Social Security subsidy based upon our final salary projections. In terms of expenses, we had all of our operating departments cut 5% of their budget from the 23-24 to bring that number down. But we also had to add in a little over 600,000 for debt service for the 15 million that we are in the process of borrowing right now. And we had some updated quotes and finalized the salary numbers. So back when I last presented, the increase was looking at about 2.86, and right now we're at 1.83 to balance the budget based on what we have today. And that is with flat state funding, since we don't know what we're going to get from them in terms of additional funds. Moving on. So as you know, our index is 6.3. So the max that you could increase taxes is 5.5 million. It's about 900,000 in revenue for every 1% tax increase. In terms of our expenditures, what's driving the increase year over year is 1.7 for a new elementary ELA program, additional debt service. We had about 4% increase to our medical costs, and our annual staff salary increases is what drives that increase. Next. So now I did not build in capital reserve. I know we talked about that at the last meeting. If the board chooses to build in capital reserve, I added this information in just so you have an idea. So right now, as I mentioned, it's a 1.83% increase to balance the budget as it is. If the board chooses to adjust the budget to include some funds for capital reserve, for each million, it's about another 1.1% tax increase. So with the 1.83, the most you could add, keeping within the index, is 4 million. So just to give you some context, if the board would like to add that in, that's kind of an additional piece. And I'll talk a little bit about another way we can get to that in a second. Next slide. In terms of tax scenarios, just to give you an idea of what that looks like, how much revenue is generated, about 900,000 for each 1%, and what that effect that has on the taxpayers, how much that's going to increase them annually. So it's about $35 per percent as an annual increase. We'll come back at the April committee meeting, and I'll need a final recommendation on what the tax increase is going to be. So I wanted to start providing this, and we can have additional dialogue at the April board meeting if needed. But that's a number I'm going to need by the end of April so we can meet our timelines with the state.
Karen, that
Yep.
median household, what value home is that?
It's right there. It's 196.6.
Did I miss it?
Yeah,
I'm sorry.
200,000.
That's okay.
Mrs. Hall?
Yes.
I think at the last meeting, we had asked for a list of proposed or hypothetical program cuts, budget savings that the administration was going to prepare to discuss at this meeting. Has that been done yet? Or is that still in process?
Well, it looks like
So that,
maybe a slide, they cut a bunch of
I'm
stuff.
sorry, I can't hear what people are
It
saying.
looks like your first slide, it showed there was a bunch of cuts.
We made some cuts, but then we had additional debt service that we had to add in. So overall it went up, but different expenses.
I'm sorry, what was that, Ms.?
Sure, I said we did cut operating expenses in each department by 5%, but we had additional debt service because we are taking on the $15 million bond that was approved at the last meeting. So the expenses increased a little bit more than last time, primarily driven by the debt service.
and as Mrs. Hall shared, we had all of the, when you look at the budget categories, the other category, if you go back to a previous presentation that she did, cut, where possible, back down 5% from the prior year. So that has been done. Those numbers have been entered, and the team, we're meeting tomorrow to go through all of the impacts of that 5% to be able to keep the conversations moving forward. We asked everyone to focus on what they would consider the low-hanging fruit. Sorry. What they would consider low-hanging fruit, as opposed to really drastic type measures where programs, et cetera, are being eliminated. So that's where we're starting. And so we're continuing to work through that. This is all entered those numbers. The team's going over everything again tomorrow. And then we'll continue the conversation with the board.
Okay, because my recollection of the conversation was that we were going to look across the board.
Yep.
Recognizing that not everything might be something we ultimately do.
Correct.
And we were gonna say, what does 5% look like
Correct.
across the board,
Yep.
including?
Yep. And so we started that process, and so the numbers were entered so we could see where we are today. Now we need to go back and look through and say, okay, what are those items specifically, and is it going to have a drastic impact? And then we will have that full piece to be able to bring back. But the team needed time to be able to go back into the budget because there's thousands of line items within the budgets for them to go through and provide that detail so that we can go and look at that.
Excuse me, I'm curious why on the chart it only goes up to the 5. Nor nobody wants to go
No,
to
I mean,
the
I-
top, but I'd like to see what those numbers are at the full Act 1. if
Right,
that
so
is
it's
not-
just, it's another 900,000 for each percent, so I can calculate that for you. I was just trying to
Okay.
give a sampling of what that might look like.
And I'm guessing, like what Mr. Brumersky was saying is then there's going to be the 5% cut was given and now get creative in, like all the little minute details of it, like what does that actually look like for our kids and for the district, like.
Right, and we want to make sure that what was there, like, as we started going through things already, we've had to go back and make some changes because there were some reductions that were made that would take away programs that were already recently approved. And so we need to make sure those are put back in because that was something that was committed to. And then that's what we're trying to work through, those back and forth items at this point. What we're finding right now is it's mostly in the supply areas. In terms of some of the other areas, other budget areas, there are some things that we're either deferring or potentially scaling back. But those are pieces that we need to work through from a team standpoint to make sure we know what impact that will be.
Mrs. Brady, just in response to your request for a higher percentage on this chart, I would suggest that if this board's not considering going above 5% tax increase, that there wouldn't be any value in having the administration do additional work to get us those numbers. So if you think you're considering going higher than 5% as part of your contribution to the discussion, then I think there's value in that. I can assure you that, I'll just speak for myself, that going above 5% is not in my wheelhouse as it relates to this discussion.
I understand nobody wants to do that, but we also have an opportunity here with a pretty high Act 1 index that we may not see again. And given what is coming in the future years as far as capital expenses, it might behoove us to take advantage of that now when we can. And I'm hearing words like deferring things. We have deferred things for many years. If we keep deferring, we still have the same problem year after year. And so I just think it might be worthwhile to see what will we lose if we don't do it now.
I just didn't want to create any extra work for the administration. If this board's not going to entertain anything over 5%, if you think you want to propose something over that, I'm fine. Mrs. Hall, if you get those numbers, I just didn't want
It's
to.
really just
column.
taking
It's a
that
column.
1%
It's adding a
and
column.
multiplying by
It's adding a
6.3.
column
Yeah.
that's
It's-
illustrated, I
Yeah,
think.
it's.
Yeah,
really
it's
not a big deal.
900,000 added to that.
Right,
The
I
only
mean, I
part
can do the math, but I think it's illustrative for others to look at the report and see that.
I have no desire to go over 5% personally, so
I
don't
understand that,
need to
but
see
it is
column
it's an
6.
entire board.
Well, and I just the full scale of information being public, I think is really important for any decisions going forward. So I don't see any issue with it. Then it's all there for people to digest.
In the interest of moving forward on this, it's a cut and paste from Excel.
Yep.
My suggestion would be to make the final column 6.3%.
That will take me I can do that in 1 minute.
Pardon me?
I said I can get that done in like a minute.
I'm sorry,
so-
Mrs. Hall.
I said I can have that updated in a minute, so I'll
Yeah,
update that for
I
you.
mean, we can probably do it right now. and fill it up.
Well, that's a PDF, so we can't, but yeah. Okay.
I have a quick question. Sorry, and maybe this is not the right time to ask. Out of pure curiosity, since Act 1 index obviously has been brought up, Mrs. Hall or others that can potentially answer this, what historically is the Act 1 index? What has that been over the last 4, 6, 8, 10 years? Again, more curiosity than anything, just as we're talking about it.
Right. So that's,
What's the range that comes in?
so that's on the slide that we're on now. I don't know if you can see that, Mr. Wagner, the,
Yes, I can. Yep, I see it. Thank you. You and I were always just right there. I mean, just great minds.
right there.
Thanks. Awesome.
So this slide is the history and then what the district tax increase has been in relation to the Act 1 index since the 17-18 school year.
And many times we've dipped very low relative to what the Act 1 index is, whereas we should have been building with that year over year to prepare for these big projects that are sitting in front of us now, rather than cutting and deferring and cutting and deferring. I'd like to see us bring that at least upward, not downward.
Well, I guess my point is, those increases as far as big capital projects are gonna not give us that much money. They're gonna be insignificant, especially if we're looking at a new high school. So I don't see the reason to overburden the taxpayers, more than we have to.
We'll, we'll never get that project going if we don't get some more capital.
Yes, and the taxpayers, they'll never get that back if you increase the millage. And as that goes over time, it becomes more and more. It's not just a flat increase, it becomes not
I understand.
exponential.
I
but-
understand.
Yeah, so.
I mean, the reality is, we can look at the numbers here, and I think there's value in seeing what the range of possibilities are, but we're gonna have to make the hard choice of, do we want a new building or a substantially renovated building? Or do we want to keep taxes relatively low? Because we're not gonna have both. And that's, I think, the fundamental decision that we have to make.
These tax increases aren't going to make a difference between a new building and a renovated building. I'm telling you, when you look at the economics and you look at the presentation by our finance bond advisor, it's not going to make that big of a difference.
Well, then what is?
What's that?
What is?
Our ability to borrow, but the only reason we need to raise taxes, if you remember from the presentation from our bond advisor, is to show that we can handle the additional payment. So we have to increase our taxes 4 or 5 years by 1.5, 1.75% to show that we can make the new bond payment for a big loan.
I think at some point, you've got to pay that back. And
Yes,
that money has to
I don't
come
know.
from somewhere.
Maybe we need to get the bond advisor in again and show that presentation. Because it's
So
not going to
Mrs.
be paid
Mrs.
back.
Hall's
I'm
going
gonna
there.
get to some of that.
Yeah, I was gonna suggest maybe we let Mrs. Hall finish her presentation, then
Okay.
we can
Yeah.
talk a little
Gotta get
more
to
about this, because we'll get stuck here for a while.
So the Independent Fiscal Office has put out some projections on what the Act One index is going to look like for the next 5 years. They gave the base index. I calculated the adjusted based on the fact that our average is about 15% over the base. So that is just simply a projection of what it's going to look like. So we are going to have a decrease in how much we can raise taxes over the next 4 or 5 years here. So just, that's the current projections. That's, you know, all we have to go on, but that's about what we're looking at. And if you go to the next slide, Mr. Graham. So what I put together here was I took those projections of our adjusted index and put in what we needed to balance the budget this year as it is right now at 183. And then if we were to take debt service of 200 million or 150 million, and then what you're left with, just for illustration purposes, just for some future planning, because we may have limited ability to add this millage in down the road. So just there for your consideration to take a look at, discuss, but I think it's worth looking at, because if it is a 4-year millage phase in, we have to start at some point if we're going to be borrowing, because we do need to pay it back. And the other point I will make is if we, let's just say you choose to put, 1.65 in the $150 million scenario. So we're not obviously paying that back because we haven't borrowed that yet. So for the first year, that money can go into cap reserve, but the millage is built in to repay that debt service when we take the money. So there is a way to get some of that to go into cap reserve as well.
So this is basically showing what I just explained, correct? That different tax increases to meet that bond payment over a 4-year period.
Exactly. Yep. So I took the two scenarios. I mean, he gave 3, but I took 150 and 200 for illustration purposes. We could always change those to 100 or whatever it might look like. But just to show, and don't forget, I also don't know what we're going to need to balance the budget in those other years. It's going to depend on a couple of things, what the salary increases are, what other, we have increasing contracts that increase every year. Transportation goes up a little bit. So those are the numbers that are unknown, but just so have an idea of how much taxing authority is left then if we are going to phase in millage for some borrowing.
If I remember correctly, you could we could spread that out one more year, two
You-
more years.
you
I'm not
could, so I-
surprised, but it
right.
would be.
Right, so the last year, we didn't, like in that scenario was 4, so I left that last
And even
minute.
in those scenarios, if we
You-
borrow those amounts, in 4 years, we have enough money in the budget to cover the debt service
Correct,
for the rest of the time.
right. And if you're building it in now, we haven't done the borrowing yet. We can put that money in cap reserve until that time.
The only piece there, Mr. Donato, is you can absolutely do that, but you need to stay consistent with that year over year, then moving forward to know that the money that was already put in is already
Yeah.
allocated. So that what you have left to close that budget, you have to be very mindful of that.
Yeah.
So there has to be a clear.
I
plan
really
to do what
think
we're doing.
that would come after we present a proposal to the community that we're planning to do a certain big project. And then they know why they're getting that additional 1.65 or 2.27%. So that we're just not randomly increasing the tax, that they understand we're doing that to get the new building or new big project renovation, whatever you have.
Right, but based on the projections, you are going to have limited ability to raise taxes.
This is the year we've got
To
We've
do it.
got
So
the
it's a
the
unique
bigger Act
opportunity.
One. The following years, we don't have that.
It's also the year that many of our homeowners are spread thin and inflation is hard on people. And our retirees and people that are limited income, maybe you don't think that's a big thing to you, but it may be to them, that increase.
I am actually a double retiree homeowner, so
That's fine.
it
Well, then
makes-
you might want to think about that.
I do.
I mean, I'm a homeowner as well, and I mean, if I look at these numbers and we're looking at a 9%. This is 9% without compounding, okay? Just for the debt service, and that's on the $200 million, that's on the $200 million plan, which does very little to get us to where we ultimately need to be. So, I mean.
I don't agree with that, Mr. Keener.
I mean,
We-
Mr. Mayor,
how
the
much
numbers are right in front of you.
Well, how
Add
much
them up.
capital do we already have in reserve that can we attack some of these existing projects?
Right, so we're sitting at 38.5 right now, plus we are in the process of getting 15 in the recent.
So we're
bond.
pushing over 50 million that can do a lot of those type 1 and type 2 projects besides the big capital high school project.
Correct. So if we borrow 200 million, that means we have 150 million left to do the high school, not counting any of the other buildings. And that doesn't even approach any of the scenarios that we saw.
Again, those are preliminary numbers and they're not, I'm trying to press upon you, they're preliminary estimates and they're not absolute. And we may be able to do this a lot cheaper, which I think we will.
I disagree.
As we pursue different options.
But it is 9% on this scenario, and that's without compounding. That's without factoring in the compounding in year 1, 2, and 3.
So
It's actually more like 11 or 12.
you're talking additional tax increases, 9% over 4 years. Is that what
Yeah.
you're talking about?
Yes. I mean, am I reading that correctly?
Yeah.
Yeah. So with compounding, it's probably more like what, 11 or 12?
Probably not quite that high, but
But, yeah.
I mean, there's a little bit.
Okay.
We can come back to that. Do you want to get to the last slide and
Yeah,
then we'll
just next
come back
steps.
around?
So next up, as Mr. Bomersky mentioned, we are going to continue to review and refine expense and revenue projections as we get updated numbers on the revenue and as we take a look at our expenses. At the April Finance Committee meeting, I'll come back with a final budget presentation and ask for a final tax recommendation. And then the May 14th board meeting, we will adopt the resolution to display and advertise final budget and approve the budget on June 11th within the state timelines.
So
Would it be helpful, Mrs. Hall, if we had some direction from tonight's meeting? I'm assuming the answer to that is yes.
I mean, it's always helpful.
It's always
but-
helpful. So I think if we can have some additional discussion and get to some idea of where we're going to be, that gives Mrs. Hall some direction at least, even if we obviously aren't making a decision tonight. So I'd like us to continue discussion around the tax increase tied into some of our financial, projects, our building projects or our facility projects. And so at least to get some kind of consensus or some kind of idea, so Mrs. Hall has that to at least generally work with.
I did have one question before we get into that discussion. We talked previously about, we may get additional money. Another, I think, 1.8 million based on Governor Shapiro's thing. So my question is, if that happens before the end of June, we can adjust things, correct? What's the
We-
latest we can wait?
Well, before we submit it to the state. So by the end.
And what's the latest we could do that?
By the end of June, June 30th.
Okay. So we do have some flexibility.
But-
If we get that 1.8 million,
So we do, while there was some initial talk early on about the state budget being approved before the June 30th deadline, several of us were just at a legislative meeting the other day, and now the expectation is probably late summer
Okay.
is the thinking. But
unless
again,
if something unexpected happens,
correct.
we could come back.
Absolutely.
Okay.
But to know that that 1.8 million, and I'll talk about this on the 9th, that was one proposal that was submitted from the Basic Ed Funding Commission. There were 2 reports. And we don't know what would come out of the other report in terms of dollar values, but I'll share more information on that on the 9th.
That's why I wanted to hear that, because that's something that we need to be advocating for as a school board. And we need to be doing that work.
But last year, how much more did we get than we thought we were gonna get?
1.2, that's what I think too.
1.2 million.
And I'll make one more point. I don't want to, if we can, I don't want to push the approval to the end of June because then our tax
Understood.
bills get out late and that's less time for us to collect and earn interest on those too. So we have to balance
We can
that.
also, I think one year we had arranged that, you can arrange a special meeting to do that. We did that one year.
Correct. But I'm saying if you're pushing it close to July 1st, then your tax bills aren't going out.
I'm saying if we
Late.
found something,
Right.
if all of a sudden the Shapiro and the Republican legislator got together and say, hey, we're gonna come up with something. I hate to tax more than we have to.
We can surely adjust, Mr. Maris. I don't think we're going to need to worry about that, knowing the track record of the state and their budget process.
Unless Mr. Maris is playing the Mega Millions tonight, and wins the billion dollars.
the mega million.
Well, tonight you can do it, and then you can. float
Donate it
us
to
a-
the school.
You can float us an interest-free loan for the 1.8 billion.
I'll just share a little perspective around tax increases in general, and then I'll leave it to the rest of you to have some discussion and I'll weigh in at some point. But my general suggestion around tax increases is to do it consistently over time, not to have spikes and decreases and spikes and decreases. And so when I look at the index, when I look at where I would expect us to be maybe over the next few years, based on some of the presentation from our financial advisors and others, and looking at what we would need to borrow, I would rather look at a long-term increase that is an appropriate, steady increase over the course of the 4 to 5, 6 years, rather than maybe going after the spike because we have that index. When I look at where we may be on that index, I don't expect that the index is going to be a barrier for us. As long as we're consistent in an increase that's appropriate year over year. And it is typically going to be a little bit more than maybe what this district's been used to when we've had 1%, 1%, 0%. I don't think that number is gonna obviously sustain us based on what we saw tonight. So I would just suggest that I'd rather personally, and I know I'm one of 9, see a steady increase rather than us push the limits 1 year and then realize we have additional funds. Typically, we will get a bit more from the state. I always go at this counting on nothing additional from the state, worst case scenario. And if we have extra, it doesn't hurt to put that in the capital fund, knowing we have extensive projects ahead of us for facilities. So that being said, I'll open it up for discussion around this topic. I know where I tentatively stand, but I'm going to hold that till I hear from the rest of you.
If you go back to slide 8, please. I guess looking at the cost, and yes, I know we haven't decided, in my own mind, I think a new high school is probably not possible, but we're still going to probably, we're allowed to budget, I believe it's 200 or borrow 223 or something like that. So the 200 million is going to build probably a reasonable or do some sort of additions or renovations or the option 4 to the high school. I guess I look at that as we're building in what it's going to cost. So I look at the top one and think the very first thing there, going with the 4.15%, we bounce the budget. We can see if there's, if they can make more cuts between now and then. So maybe that 1.83% is a little less, but we start building in for the debt service to borrow this money. If that makes sense, and that's my thought about it.
I guess my only point is, we haven't made that decision yet, whether we're gonna go with a new building. So to slap that additional tax without presenting it to the community and telling them what we're doing, I don't know.
I mean, telling them what we're doing specifically or telling them that we need to do something, because I mean, I just can't get over how long I've heard we need to do something. And I think it's fiscally irresponsible to continue to not make those decisions, to wait or continue to make little, like if you go back to slide 6, I mean, it shows historically the decisions that have been being made. And it has not gotten us where we need to be planning wise. So I think there needs to be a change in thought. So we're not dealing with this for another 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 years.
Those decisions and those lower tax increases did not prevent us from pursuing a building.
You
That-
just
That's
said,
what you're thinking.
but you just said we probably can't build a high school. So that's contradicting. That is going to prevent us from it.
What I'm saying is the difference between the Act One index and what we ended up doing did not make a difference whether or not we could do a big building project.
It may have made a difference as far as our staffing levels and the other opportunities that we're presenting to our students and to our teachers. And when we keep asking them to cut and take away and find that low hanging fruit, whether it's in the classrooms or in any of the other departments, we just keep year over year asking, cut it more, cut it more, cut it more. I think we can do better.
I think
Well,
we
the-
can do better as well, but I don't think that, I
Well-
think so far, we haven't seen, at least at this level, the results of hard questions about what we can do more efficiently. And this is not directed at any one person, at any one department. We have a lot of administrators, we have a lot of courses, we have some courses that are significantly undersubscribed. We spend a lot of money on a lot of different athletic teams. We spend a lot of money on performing arts, all of which are generally good things in a world of limitless resources. But we don't live in a world of limitless resources. And frankly, as a district, we've done a relatively poor job of saying no to new and shiny things. And now we're paying the price for that. Yes, we have a sustainable model right now. We can have all of our nice shiny things. I don't think we can have all of our nice shiny things and a brand new building and keep taxes low. It's the old joke about going to the mechanic. And do you want a good job, a cheap job, or a quick job, and you can have 2 or 3. That's sort of where we are right now. And it's for this board to pick which of the 2 we want. Because right now, we're still in the world of trying to have all 3, and I don't think that's sustainable.
Yeah, I guess my other point is, we haven't even agreed as a board what we're gonna do. Mr. Garber and Mr. Keener expressed concern of whether we do need a new building, so we may just do renovations and be under 100 million. So to go ahead and put that increase in there without knowing exactly what we're gonna do, I don't think you need to put that full increase in yet until we figured out what we're gonna do. I think it's irresponsible to the taxpayers to just say, okay, we think we're gonna do 200 million, but then we don't do it, then we've increased the taxes more than we had to.
I think it's incredibly responsible to save and to plan ahead. Period.
Say what?
I said, I think it's incredibly responsible to increase now if we have to, so we have what we need for future projects. I think it is irresponsible to do it the other way. I know it sounds good to say, let's not raise taxes.
But my point is, we don't know what that project is.
But
So
we
to
know
make it,
it's going to be a lot.
but,
And we know it's not
but-
going to get cheaper over
but it may
time.
not be 200 million, it may be 100 million. The 2.3 additional
Not gonna be
percent,
100 million.
what's that?
There's no way we can accomplish what we need to accomplish for $100
Well,
million.
that depends what we end up doing. I understand. I've supported possibly looking at a new building, but we don't know enough yet to say, well, that's what we're doing. Or even a partial new building.
I don't know. I feel like after attending meetings for a long time, I know enough and I know that it's a lot we're gonna need, regardless of new building, renovated building, period. And the number is only going up over time.
I agree with Mr. Keener about a lot of the stuff. We as a board need to make some hard cuts because we can't do it all, right? And so just cutting 5% each department doesn't necessarily answer the question, because some departments you can't cut, some departments you can cut 10%, right? So I think we need to look at the hard decisions that we're gonna have to make moving forward and not just balance the budget now. I think it's a discussion that needs to continue to happen and go forward. And like Mr. Keener said, like, what are those hardest discussions that we need to have? We need to have them now. To answer Mr. Mayor's question, I don't want to go to the top index by no means, but if we decide to do a lower project next year, we don't raise taxes. So I don't think that raising taxes this year is going to hurt us in the long run. But I am not going to the top. I can tell you that right now.
Mr. Wagner, do you have any comments if you're listening?
I am listening. I have a comment or two, and I have a question as well. First, my comment. I think Mr. Wohlgemuth, I probably side with kind of your philosophy on this, probably more than anything. I don't want to see spikes either, right? I mean, you can't. For me, it doesn't make sense. And I think it's a bad move to go super high one year, super low the next, super high. That to me, that's just a game of ping pong. And I think it's unnecessary. So I think, to your point, if we can find something that's relatively steady, that's not going to crush people, but I think that's going to set us up for, I just think it's a pretty responsible move. I'm also of the mindset with Mr. Maris, probably more than anyone. I think, I look at myself. I mean, I think about the district, right? And I think that there's what, 70% of our homeowners, or 70% of our residents, I should say, do not have children in the school, maybe over that. And, and so if I increase taxes by a certain number, there's some explaining to do there, right? And there's some things to think about for that 70 or 72% of that of our resident population. So I think about those folks as well. So it's easy for someone like a Mrs. Eshelman or me or Mr. Garber or those of us that have kids in the school. I've got a 5-year-old. Yeah, of course. I want the very best for my kids, because that's where they're going to school for the next 15 years of their life, 10 years of their life. So I want the very best, of course, but I also think that there's a balance that we need to kind of strike. Where that balance is, I don't know, but that's why this discussion is taking place, which is a good one. But I'm certainly not of the mindset to pump taxes up unnecessarily. To Mr. Maris's point, we don't know where we're going to go yet, and that leads to my question. And this is for Mrs. Hall. When I think about 900 grand for every point, so let's say we do 300 or 3%, let's say we do 4%, let's say we do 4.5%, let's say we do 5%. I don't know the number, pick one, right? For Mrs. Hall, when we're talking about capital projects that could range in the $250 million range, whatever that number is going to end up looking like over the course of time for all of our buildings. This isn't just about the high school. This is about every single building that frankly needs work, especially over the next 5, 6, 8, 10, 12 years. So when I think about tax increase, Mrs. Hall, you know, truly how much impact are we talking when we are talking about 3.4% versus 3.9 versus 4.5 versus 5? I mean, because at the end of the day, between 3 and 5%, we're talking about $1.8 million on a $250 million project. It's kind of like, and so what I'm interested in is how much impact is that truly over the short and long term financially for this district? Because unless, you know, because I want to make sure that we're not, you know, that we're answering that question the right way and thinking about it the right way. Because if you told me that $1.8 million for a $250 million, that's like spitting on a forest fire. And I just want to make sure that we're looking at this the right way. And so I'm curious as to what the true impact is when we think about things over the next 4, 8, 12 years, 20 years of paying this back.
Right,
How many
you're-
hairs are we splitting?
Well, so you're building it in over time, if I'm understanding your question correctly. You're
Yep.
building it in time so you can afford to pay back the debt service. So if you're
Yep.
taking 200 million, you have to start to build that in year over
course.
year. So it's there, you added it in this year, it's 1.8. It's there next year plus whatever you're adding next year. So you have to start to be able to build that so you have the money, because I feel like I don't have the debt service chart in front of me. So we're at about, I don't know, 8.5 million this year. It goes up to 16. It's a pretty significant increase what we owe in debt service, depending on how much you borrow. So you have to start building that in for when those payments start to phase in, because they will kind of try to smooth them out so you have pretty consistent payments, but at some
Yep.
point it's going to spike and you have to have the millage built in and the money there to be able to tax to pay for that.
And Mr. Wagner, respectfully, when you said about 70% of Hempfield residents who don't have children in the district, I would argue that that 70% values public education and values the reputation and all the wonderful things going on in Hempfield. So to say that they wouldn't, you know, like that I'm invested because I have young children or you're invested because you have young children, I think our public is invested, whether they have children in the district currently or not. And that's something that's really important in a community that supports their public schools. So I just wanted that on.
Yeah, I
I would-
don't disagree with you, Mrs. Eshelman. And listen, just because somebody else, just because we have kids and somebody else doesn't mean that they're not invested. I never said that, right? And I'm not going to speculate to the other 38,000 people that don't have kids. I'm sure they all care. I'm sure many of them care. But at the end of the day, there's also a bold line of distinction that we need to make sure we think about as it relates to, yes, I care about education and what's best for our community and our children and our families, and me not being able to put food on my table because my taxes are going up $200 every, you know what I mean? Like, that's the stuff I think about. I'm not saying that no one's invested and no one cares. What I'm saying is that I need to think, I can't speculate for the 38,000 people that don't have kids. I just need to make sure that we are thinking about those folks, right?
I would venture to say that 70%, if you ask them, well, would you rather have a 6 or a 3% tax increase? I think probably 99% would be for the lower increase. So, and I'm not
You
saying
can
I'm not
ask me
supporting
that
education,
too,
but I
but-
would bet
Say
you,
100%.
yeah, maybe 100%.
But they also understand the importance of funding this district.
But they're
And-
also probably some of them retirees and older and say, why can't you do with what you got? You know, we did
Yeah.
a lot better, but we did with less. And now what do you want all this fancy stuff for? Not saying I'm agreeing with them, but that would be what they would say.
Or they would look at our reserves and say, you're staring down the barrel of over 50 mil in your bank, in the bank. Like, what are you doing? You know, so, but again, a lot of folks don't understand this, like, you know, they don't understand this stuff, right? They see one thing. They see how much am I being taxed and how much am I not being taxed. Take your dog for a walk and just talk to the public and see how many of them like pull you aside and say, why'd you increase taxes 4.5%? Happens to be every year, other than the year we did 0, even if we do 1%. So again, I'm not saying that we need to go to 1. I think the days of the 1%, to Mr. Vogelman's point, I don't think we're going to be reliving those days anytime soon. But I do want to make sure that we are, you know, thoughtful in our approach and we are creating stability and consistency. I think it's a prudent move.
That's why I think it's, as we jump with an increase part of the tax that pays for the bond, but we haven't even decided what we're doing yet. You may be taxing more than you have to, because if we only do a renovation and it's less than 100 million, that number drops in half.
If I recall, months ago, we talked about community listening sessions to find out what the community wants. What are they looking for in our future building plans? What is important to them within the district that we maintain? That hasn't happened. You know, why haven't we done that? Why haven't we started asking, what is it that people are looking for? What is it that they want in our upgrades or renovations or new builds? Because until we listen to them, we're taking stabs in the dark here.
Well,
So
I think they're looking to us to come up with some recommendations, and I think, Mr. Bremersky, Mrs. Hall, correct me if I'm wrong, as we go further down the line, and we come up with what the administration and the board feels is the right option, I think there would be significant rollout to the community to explain what we're planning on doing. Am I saying that right?
Correct.
Who hasn't had a chance to weigh in on this? I guess I'll just add my thoughts to this process, and it ties back to what I shared earlier. First of all, I'll agree with Mr. Keener and Mr. Garber on the fact that the way that you move through a tax increase in a project like this is to be able to show the public also that you're controlling your expenses and you're managing things wisely. That people are willing to pay their taxes if they feel like you're not using their money wastefully. And I'm not suggesting we are, but I do think that we have tried to have a lot of things, the shiny things, add a lot of programs. We're not quick to get rid of anything, but we are quick to add, and all those things typically add cost. So I think there has to be a concerted effort to make sure that we can assure the public that we are appropriately managing expenses, that we're maximizing the classes that we have with the utilization. And when I say ROI, return on investment, that's a financial term, but it applies to if I have a class with 10 students in versus 20 students, and I'm running 2 of those with 10 students in instead of 1 with 20, that's a problem. So whether we need to manage that differently, those are things, and that's where we have an opportunity as a district to show the public that we're going to manage expenses. I can tolerate, and I think the public can tolerate, an increase in taxes because they care if they know we're using their money wisely. If they feel we're not using their money wisely, good luck in getting any tax increase. Even 1% is going to go over like a lead balloon. So that being said, I would also suggest that an example to what you shared of, does it really matter if we do 2% or 3%? It's such a drop in the bucket compared to our budget. It would be no different than me coming back to you and saying, well, you know what? A 3% increase for your salary versus 1%, there really isn't any difference. So I'll just give you the 1% because it doesn't really matter at the end of the day. It's just small potatoes for your increase. So when you look at it that way, I think it puts it into perspective very quickly, because this is really like giving a raise to you. So if you take it home to your world, and you say, well, my company just gave me 1%, because it's not much different if they give me 1% or 3%. You know, that's cumulative over time. And that's what we're trying to describe here related to taxes. And finally, I would suggest that we're probably going to have some people in this room that want to do 4.15% under the first option or higher. There's going to be others that want to go less than the 3.48% or 3.5% in the second option. I'm going to suggest that we try to find a happy medium between where the index is and where some of you probably want to be. And I'm going to throw out, and we're not asking for a vote, straw poll. I'm trying to use Mr. Keener's language, is not coming out right. But we're going to run just a general idea of where we might land. And I'd suggest we try to find a happy medium somewhere around the 3.5%. But then we look at being consistent with that over the course of a number of years. Maybe rather than going high this year and coming down. If you look at the index or where we're projected to be, a 3.5% is going to be under the index with the projections. And even if we'd fall a little bit below that, I still think we'd be okay. So I'm going to suggest maybe we start with a ballpark of around 3.5%, which is somewhere probably in between where some of you want to be and others of you are. So I'm not asking for a vote. We're not taking any vote. So this is just conversation.
Mr. Wolgamott, I do have a question or a concern on that. We may say that moving forward, we'd like to see that more flat line, flat line, that it's not spiking or dropping. But we don't really have control over what future boards may decide. As we don't have control about what past boards chose to do. We only have control over where we are today. And so I guess that said, I don't think it's a bad, I think we would like to know from the state every year what we can expect, and everybody else would like to know what can we expect in our taxes year over year. But that is all based on who, other board members are in the future and what they would vote on. And we can't promise that.
No, and nor are we promising that. But I think if we come at this from a consistent approach, the next board members, whether we're here or not, at least over the next few years, are going to see the need to maintain some semblance of a steady increase that gets us to the end, to the finish line. So I would suggest that we look at it that way and not worry maybe that the next board might come in at 1%, even though that's the reality is they could come in at 0. I don't think that's going to happen, but I can't guarantee that either. I do think being steady with that increase is steady wins the race when it comes to taxes, not we're going to do 6% this year and create an uproar. Then next year, because we don't need the money, we're going to go down to 1 or 0. That just is that, I think you described it best, Mr. Wagner, is a ping pong match that we don't need to be in. Is there any, I don't want to say somewhat of a consensus that we could get close to that 3.5% and somewhat give some direction to Mrs. Hall?
I'm not ready to start speculating on percentages until I see real cuts from the administration. When we see what a 5% reduction in expenses across the board looks like, then I think we have a good baseline to start doing this. And I had hoped that we would have that this time. I thought we were going to have it this time. We don't, that's fine. Hopefully we'll have it for the next meeting and we can go from there.
Is that, oh, go
So
ahead.
we did put in a 5%, but you have to remember 72% of our budget is wages and benefits.
I understand.
And that's not what,
Paul.
okay, I was just,
I understand
Alright,
how
I'm
that works,
finished.
okay? 5% means 5%. And
No, I
No,
and
but-
that
Okay, Fran.
includes making challenging decisions on the staffing side. Not saying that we're gonna implement them,
I'm
but
not
it
arguing with you.
includes, that's what that includes.
Right,
No,
but
I
that
was simply just
5%,
clarifying what we did.
okay, and I wanted to
No,
clarify.
I mean, I'm being
too.
lectured about what 5%, I know
No,
how our
no,
budget.
You're not being lectured on that. What we're trying to say is,
Sounds like I am.
you're not, but what we're trying to say is the direction was to reduce the other items. The other budget items such as building budgets, department budgets, athletic budget, things like that by 5%. We did not touch, when I talk about those other categories, we did not go down the salary benefits, transportation, debt, and special ed in terms of student placement, et cetera, because those are right now pretty finite. And those are more of those larger impact type decisions. So
Correct.
the 5% that we're talking about is on about $14 million or so of the entire budget.
Right,
That's
that's
what
not
we
going to
started.
get us where we need to be.
Understand, but I'm trying to clarify what the ask was of
Okay.
what. we
I think
did.
there was a misunderstanding about the ask, that's fine,
so-
we don't have to revisit that.
No, and that's
Yeah.
okay, but also think it's important that when we have retirements, we look at every one of those positions to determine, do we need to replace? That helps reduce from a staffing standpoint. So we are in the process of looking at our retirements to determine what is that impact on our programming across the board. I can say right now, we are going to not be replacing all the retirement positions.
Terrific, that's what.
So
I'm
there's
talking
that piece. But looking back into the future, all from a staffing standpoint, whether it's teachers, administrators, support staff, that has been the approach over the last several years. If you recall about 4-5 years ago, timeframe, We had 9 more administrative positions than we do today. Our teaching positions are less than they were in the past. Our support staff positions are less than they were in the past. So we're at the point where those hard discussions around what are we going to continue to offer is going to come into play. When we look at class size, we have numbers and kind of what we follow at the elementary. Middle school is a teaming approach, so it's very, probably the easiest one to work on staffing. From a high school standpoint, it's probably around 2% of all of the classes in the high school that are 10 or less students in a class. And those classes are more like independent studies or classes that the high school is doubling up. So if it's a world language, for example, they may be doing a level 3, 4 together. Independent study is paired up into another class. Well over 80+% of the classes have 15, 16 or more students in those classes. So those are the things that we have been looking at over the last several years. And I know our administrators and I keep looking at that to say, are we running these classes or not? In terms of the classes where we are starting to not offer classes are in some of the areas where there are only a handful of students that are asking to take a specific AP class or a specific language. And we're starting to say, okay, we're not going to offer it this go around. Maybe we'll try again down the road so that hopefully by the time they finish their high school experience, they have that opportunity. That's ultimately where we're going to be, because when you look at the budget at 72% being salary and benefits, that's where you're going to have to make changes if you're looking for large dollar values to put away.
Yeah, I don't disagree. And I was just going to suggest the same thing, that 72% of this budget is personnel and benefits, probably our most valuable part of the budget, but also the most expensive portion of the budget. And so I would even suggest that not just waiting for retirements, but it's good to look at, are we going to run this class? And do we not run it again?
Right.
Because if you're going to not run it, but then run it again later, we backfill individuals' work, we do things with that I believe, and then we run it again later when there's interest. That doesn't really accomplish any financial savings at the end of the day. I mean, we can do it by attrition, but that doesn't necessarily get us where we need to be. I think we really need to look at, if we're not showing interest in it, maybe it's time to just eliminate that option as an elective altogether, and then incur the savings from that, not just eliminate it for that semester or for that year. But that doesn't add up to financial savings at the end of the day, because we are still paying people to be in the district. They just have been reassigned to do something else during that time.
Correct. And all of that's based on certification. So there are those instances where we are looking at to say, do we need to continue this? And if not, then that's the path we are going down.
Mrs. Hall, you had mentioned earlier, I think in this presentation, that medical costs went up 4%. My recollection is that's been pretty flat until this past year.
We've been pretty flat generally. Yeah.
What does that 4% represent in dollars?
I'll have to get you that number because it's just the
Okay.
medical piece and I have it all bundled together. So I'd have to pull that out.
Is
but
there
it's an idea.
anything I know we've done a lot of creative things to keep that low. Is there anything else we can do? Because that one's probably not insignificant.
Not.
That's contractual. And so at the end of the day, no, Mr. Maris, no, I mean, there is stuff we can do, but that has to be part of the process of contract negotiations.
You're talking about, yeah, but we also have medical for non-contract people too, right?
Correct.
So that 4% is part of
But
everyone,
it's
right?
total claims exposure. Yeah.
Okay. That's just something, that's a bit that we could look at. I'm kind of where Mr. Keener is. I'd like to see if there's additional cuts. I'm not ready to commit. And the additional thing is, I don't know if we're going to do this additional money towards a capital, whether it's 150, 200 million, somehow I'd like to make the public aware why we did that additional 1.5% increase. I don't know if that's possible or what the rest of the board thinks about that, just to help people understand why we have a higher tax increase.
Yeah, that's our job.
Yep.
To communicate that.
Yeah, I'm saying
Yeah.
somehow though, I mean, I'm amazed we get very few people in here to look at our budget. Other things get more people here, and I'm just surprised we don't get more from the community to look at our budget.
I mean, I look to our department with Kelly and also to our partner with LNP. to help us out with some of that describing of maybe breaking that down. And I can't, express what they put in the paper, but at the end of the day, depending on how that article goes out, a lot of our constituents read the paper. And I think if it gets described appropriately there, it may be helpful in explaining it and communicating that message. So that's where our PR department and communications team can handle that and work through that. But I think I have to go back to this slide number 2, and the team has gone back and tried to revise this and lowered the amount some too. So I think you can kind of see where we are. You know that the balance of budget as it stands today with no increase from the state, we're looking at a 1.83% increase. So that's where I'd suggest the 2% comes from. My proposal of around a 3.5 gives another 1.5 to consider for the capital in the hopes that we get additional monies from the state and that we'll have more at the end of the day than we thought, and that some of those cuts that we've talked about that we may not be able to have every detail of, which I think may be a little unrealistic for the administrative team, would fall into place over the year and that we would end up better than we expect. I know our goal is to put 5 million away in the capital. I think we're going to have to go into it this year expecting to put less than that away. And when I suggest less, I mean about a 1.5% of our tax increase, which turns out to be a little less than $1.5 million that we would have set aside, hoping that state comes in higher and hoping that our cuts / I don't want to call them cuts, that's probably too harsh, but our adjustments that we make with expenses will help to backfill some of that. So that's how I landed about the 3.5. You're looking at about a 1.5 to put away and about a 2% to balance the budget as it stands today, with the hopes that it's a little better than what we see here today.
I think the other piece of this that we need to be mindful of, without getting into too much detail, is we are currently in the midst of collective bargaining. And that is a blank slate for the board and the union to reimagine how we do these things and look for efficiencies that recognize the outstanding contributions of our faculty, but find efficiencies so we can recognize them in new and creative ways and not focus on historic notions of how faculty compensation look. Looking at fringe benefits, looking at the whole piece from a fresh perspective, and hopefully we can come to a creative solution that honors the faculty in a more cost-effective way. There are a lot of inefficiencies in the CBA right now, but we have a wonderful every 4 or 5 year opportunity to fix those things.
At the end of the day, the teachers do still deserve to be paid for their professional stature. And Hempfield has built a reputation of excellent teachers, excellent education, excellent opportunities for our kids. And I think we have to look at what our values are. Yes, nobody, myself included, likes to raise taxes or have taxes raised on us. But are we willing to say that Hempfield will no longer have the opportunities and the status and the excellence that we've come to expect from Hempfield, that the rest of, people hear Hempfield and they're like, oh, great teachers, great opportunities for your kids. But as we continue to cut and forestall and not do, that's getting chipped away at over and over again. And I really feel like, part of the taxing is a value statement of we value Hempfield having top quality education, top teachers, top opportunities for our kids. That's why people move here. That's why they invest in buying homes here. And as we start to maybe not hit those marks, people are going to be choosing other school districts. Maybe they're going to go to LS or Penn Manor or Township instead. And that hurts our tax base. It becomes a negative cycle. As a parent, you scrimp and you save where you can, but you put money away in savings for your kids' future education. It hurts, but you do it. And sometimes I really feel like we have to do better by our kids and our teachers and our buildings and not keep putting things off. I've been around here long enough to know that we put things off over and over and over again, and I'm tired of that.
My general comment would be that our investment is much bigger than just that portion that you and Mr. Keener, Mrs. Brady and Mr. Keener have talked about. Our investment includes our investment in an ELA program, for example. Our investment includes the buildings. And I think we have to look at it holistically, listening to your discussion, when we consider our investment in our teams. So if we invest in certain areas, to Mr. Keener's point earlier, we can't do all three things and do them well as we've always done them. And so I think there has to be a recognition that that investment comes in different forms. It can come in the form of a better building with more light, more usable space. It can come in the form of a program. It can come in many different forms. So we just have to keep that in mind as a board. We're to look at this holistically for the district, and we have to look at it that way when we look at everything that we do.
Yeah, I would agree on that. We definitely look holistically because you raise taxes, too much people don't move in the area because their houses cost so
Yep.
much, right? And then, but we still want good education, so we have to balance the two to make it work. It's everything. It's not just one smoking gun.
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, I don't know if you include in the next budget presentation, the millage of the different school districts, but we're in a nice spot in the middle. And Mrs. Brady, I don't think Hempfield is going to go down overnight, but I agree with you saying we need to value our staff, but we need to be responsible too. And if our millage goes up to we're a top millage school, that scares people away too. Okay. And then you may even lose teachers because of that. So we have to be responsible in all different areas.
And on that, Mrs. Hall, could we also see, because I don't know this information, local school districts ahead of a big investment in facilities, what that looked like? Because I feel like I remember something about Penn Manor, but I have.
Yeah, and they did exactly what we're proposing to do. In fact, I talked to their one of their board members is on the IU with me, and they went, I think, 4 years, and they had a much higher tax increase. But then after they got the building built, they went back down. In fact, I think they went back to a 0% after that.
Okay.
They built in the millage, as Mrs. Hall talked about, to make sure that they can afford what would happen as a result of the increased debt. And so, as Mrs. Hall shared, our current millage is about 8.5 million. If you basically take 200 million plus, you're going to double your debt load. So you have to build in the millage to be able to get the revenue to pay for that. You're not going to pay for that by just eliminating or cutting programs.
And Mr. Wohlgemuth, I appreciate your comments about PR and stuff, because I think that's an important part of this. Help our homeowners and our taxpayers understand, oh, that's why you're going an additional 1.5%.
Is it, are there other comments? I don't want to cut the discussion short, but it sounds like, we all need to go back and we need to be prepared to come with a reasonable idea of where we want to be so we can come to some consensus, because we do have to make decision on this, and I don't want to be behind on doing that as it relates to what Mrs. Hall needs to move things forward. So I'm going to suggest that if you need more time to figure things out, you take that time between now and the next meeting. And then when we come back together, we're prepared to make a decision and move things forward. Is that fair?
Between now and next board meeting or next finance meeting?
Next finance meeting, which is April 30th. Anybody have any objection to that idea?
Not on my end. That makes sense to me.
Helpful if maybe we could get, when we get those additional potential budget adjustments, send them out to the board so we can consider them in advance of the meeting, so we can email them out, so we're not trying to digest everything sitting around the table.
Depending on what they are, I may need to do an exec session on personnel,
Yeah, that's
as
fine.
opposed to sending things out.
We could add that on with the
Or
policy,
you,
even the
or you
policy.
could bring some of them to our April board meeting too, if you had some information then.
Okay, anything else for the 24-25 budget? All right, hearing nothing, then we'll go to Mr. Graham. We have a replacement of the high school paging system.
Yeah, this is actually more of a discussion item just between this and buildings and grounds. One of the priority one items on the feasibility study was paging systems at the high school. LMS and LPC, not just the high school itself. All of these systems date back to the nineties with some early 2010s emergency upgrades we did to patch things together. But all of these systems are out of warranty, difficult to service. If you're a computer user, the only browser we can use to manage them is the original Internet Explorer. We've been collecting parts on eBay when we can to keep things patched and running, but the plan was to continue patching them until we got to a plan with renovations. However, recently we did start seeing some failures at the high school. In particular, during one event where the high school administrative staff did need to urgently communicate with the building. It took us about 30 minutes of attempting to troubleshoot before doing some hard resets to bring that equipment back. So why I added this as a discussion point is that I don't know if the high school system is going to continue until we get to a renovation. We have not seen problems at LPC. LMS did get hit by lightning last year, and it took us about a week to source the replacement parts, but that building has been running since then. So the ask, or at least the item for discussion, was whether or not you'd be amenable to us looking at doing an RFP to begin work on replacing these systems, given their age, the difficulty in maintenance, and the issues we've started to see at the high school, which is definitely becoming more of an issue. The good news is, at least at the high school, I certainly do not want to invest any of the district's money in something that is going to be tossed out if the building gets renovated. The components of the high school we are having the most trouble with are all centrally located. This is the control units, the amplifiers. It's not the speakers and wiring in the classrooms. Although they are old, they would need to be looked at in a renovation. That's not what we're talking about here in terms of urgency. That, if it does get replaced, is something that could be carried forward into a new building without any waste, so to speak. LMS and LPC, obviously we're not in the big picture talking about massive changes or renovations. So I would want probably a closer look there at whether or not we can replace the entire system versus the just the head-end units. But because all three of these are the same age, I know we have discussed several times about looking at getting some economies of scale, doing projects together. This is one opportunity that's out there. And again, with the high school, there was some urgency, which is why I just wanted to bring it to the board for some discussion. As pricing goes, this paging systems are not cheap. We replaced CMS and CES last year as a joint project. That was similar to what we're talking about here, just a replacement of the head end, not the speakers in the classrooms. That was about $97,000 for both buildings at the end of the day, which is fairly close in line with what we had listed in the feasibility study for those line items, depending on what we ultimately decide to do inside of classrooms. But I wanted to bring that just as a discussion item tonight to share with you. We are seeing some signs of failure on things that may not make it, and look to you for what you kind of like me to do with that, if with an RFP, or if you want me to continue keeping things running as best as possible.
Is this budgeted?
This is a priority one item in the feasibility study. I mean, it's the feasibility study budget. I don't know any other way to put that.
But this has already been noted as something that needs to be repaired. The feasibility study pulled this out already, and you're just feeling an extra urgency at this point.
It's one of the priority one items that I think are we, I don't know how much in depth you're going to in buildings and grounds, but it has been consistently one of those priority one items that we have talked about in all of the meetings previously.
My feeling, not knowing all the minutia of it, is it sounds like it's a safety issue to have paging systems that aren't operating, or at least that can't be counted on. And if it's been already identified as a priority one item, it's something that I feel like, and that can be moved forward if needed, can be taken to a new build or a new renovation. I think it's something you should move forward on.
You typically won't be taking that to a new build or renovation. Is that correct, Mr. Graham?
Well, no, at the high school, what we're talking again, the head end unit, the control unit, that could easily be carried forward into a new building. That would not be a waste of equipment in any way.
But that's probably not that much cost, right? Compared
No,
to the project. That's a
the-
very
the-
small percentage.
Yeah, the huge amount of cost with the high school is gonna be the wiring, the speakers in the classrooms, which to make sure things are working today does not require any changes. It's what we're seeing the failures on are the amps, the head end unit, the control unit. They are all centrally located. They would very easily be carried forward into another building, even whether it's a new building or a new wing or something like that. That is not equipment that would get tossed out in a renovation or new construction.
I mean, I wouldn't want us, well, like even finishing the year, like when I think of the length of the school year, finishing the year without that kind of safeguard. But then I wouldn't want to go into next year starting off that way. I just feel like that leaves like a lot of unknowns for safety for the high school, and I don't feel comfortable with that.
I feel a little differently about this compared to Mrs. Brady and Mrs. Eshelman. My thoughts around this are that if you're going to put $100,000+, and it's going to be more than that because the high school's huge, that's going to be lost dollars. So whatever project we do, most of that money, to Mr. Garber's point, is going to disappear into the sunset. We do have a system that's functional. It does require a little more work. I'm going to suggest that you limp it along until we have a better plan in place. And I know, I'm one of many, but I'm not in favor of spending those dollars in that old building. It'll be no different than saying we're going to start to change out the HVAC in the old building and then do a project in a couple years. We're limping that along as well. So we could get into a lot of details around all of this, but it is not a direct safety issue that I've heard of. It would be a desirable change because it's obviously going to be something that doesn't have to be repaired. But I could not get behind suggesting we go around changing that at this point in time, knowing we're going to be doing a full-blown, full-scale project there. I think you're taking a couple $100,000 and you're washing it down the drain.
I think I'd like a clarification. I understood you to say that the high school, it's a central unit. It would not be all the individual classroom speakers. And the central unit is something that could be repurposed in a new construction. That's
That
what
is
I
correct.
understood.
That is correct. Yeah,
Okay, so we're not washing the money down the drain.
Right. So just to give you an example, when we did CMS last year, we left all of the classroom speakers intact. What we replaced was the control unit. That cost was around $48,000. I'd have to go back and look. Some of that is labor. There's obviously a good chunk of it that's labor, that's repatching everything, changing everything out. And the other half of that was the equipment that went in to control everything. Systems that you're going to put in today are all IP based. You're able to add on additional units. So from terms of scaling, it's not like the old analog systems where you had tons and tons and tons of equipment that went to it. It's a much different architecture with how they're designed. Again, that equipment would not be would not be tossed out in this situation. One of the other things that we purposely did multiple years ago, not multiple, in 2021, we did a kind of comprehensive search of paging systems, if you will, with representatives from principals of all grade level or all levels of the district, the security team, the tech department, to look for a standardized paging system that basically would meet all of the different levels of the district going forward. The system we ended up picking went into Mountville, Rohrstown, and the two Centervilles as a basically feature for feature replacement, which was bells and paging. There were many, many other features that were available. If you're familiar with the emergency light systems, if the teacher hits a panic button in their room, there's a light that goes on outside for easily locating where that panic button has been pressed, hallway clocks or hallway displays, things like that. There's a lot of other features we chose not to implement, but they are all there. If we got into new construction, renovation, that would all be an option to add on. So we're not hindering ourselves by investing in a system today. Those are all features that can be added on going forward.
Thank
Mr.
you.
Graham, what percent of those costs are installation costs? Would you estimate?
I would have to go back and look. It might be close to 50.
So that 50% would be lost if we have to put it into a new school. So,
Depending on how much of the building at the high school ended up getting torn down, correct.
My question would be, just remember from teaching, there's certain codes that go out for the paging system. Maybe that has changed, but if you want to do exit to school, the principal will announce, whatever the code is, which means the teacher should be doing something. If the paging system isn't working, that isn't going out, correct? So to me, that's a safety concern.
Do our phones allow us to page? Most phones you can page the phone,
Yes, you can dial the paging system from all the phones.
and so all the phones would activate their work as a paging system?
Yes.
Okay, so we do have a
That-
backup.
Well, no,
Hmm.
the phone, calling the paging system from the phones is there today. What died at the high school was the whole system. So
Right.
whether you mashed the mic in the office or called on the phone, nothing worked. There is not a intercom page all backup system in the phone system, if you will. There's some phone systems you can basically do an all call and the speakerphones kick on and things like that. That we do not have that.
And is that a programming issue that you could adjust if needed? If they're an IP phone, most times you can
There-
reprogram it or
There is.
get software to upgrade that.
We've never tested it on a building that large.
That-
We tried.
That would be, again, my concern would be the safety issue.
If you can upgrade, if the phones can be upgraded, there's a backup to a
If
backup,
it would be
right?
cheaper, yeah. I mean,
Right,
that's-
and then you could maintain the system we have, because the system we have is not broken, right? And maybe we just buy a couple extra parts, if that's what it is, but the system is not broken.
I guess what I heard at the beginning
Yeah.
is it's very hard to get the parts.
Well, it's hard, it's just because it's hard to get them, we can't get them.
Yeah, but it takes time. So then there's a safety issue in that time waiting for the part.
I would rather see us buy extra parts and spend a couple $1,000s on parts that are sitting around than spend $100 and some $1,000s on a new system only to be potentially destroyed if we do a new building, maybe saved a little if it's a reno.
I would agree.
I'm ambivalent on this. The request was not to buy a new paging system. The request was to do an RFP. An RFP cost nothing. If there's data, I mean, I don't know if I'm gonna support this or not. I want to see the information and let's go from there.
Well, I think the takeaway is I can do an RFP. There's a good bit of labor and time involved in that. I can tell you the cost that comes back for it for the high school will be $50,000 to $70,000. The cost for LMS and LPC, which are of the same vintage that also need to be addressed, are also going to be in the $50,000 range as well. So while the high school has some urgency, we do have to do those other buildings at some point in the future. But to your point, Mr. Keener, yes, I was asking about an RFP, but if there is no will to proceed at this point, I would rather save the time and focus my efforts on band-aiding things. But that was the reason this was a discussion item, is to get some feedback from all of you on what you would be willing to support.
I'd like to see this more of a budget item, because I don't think it's an item that we need to do now that's not in the budget. That's just my personal.
Yeah, I agree. I don't like surprises mid-year. If we've talked about this before. My recommendation is that you don't waste your time doing an RFP, and I'm one of 9. So I'll look to the rest of you, but I'm not even interested in you wasting your time doing an RFP at this point. I don't think it's wise use of dollars.
I would say just how you don't like surprises financially. I don't like surprises of the safety mechanisms we have at the high school going out. And again, that's why we need to move along with things. It's just going to continue to happen.
I think to your point, Mr. Garber, as a safety expert in the room and dealing in part of the safety committee, I mean, what you say carries a lot of weight with me, and I do think there's other options here. And if anybody would be upset about safety, I would think it would be you. So when you're saying, that, hey, I think there's other ways here, it carries a lot of weight.
I guess my other question, I'm hearing this is still a priority 1 item, even with the revisions we asked for at this point. So this would be something we could discuss with capital. What are we doing with it? I'm just concerned. I'm more coming back to, again, remembering the codes and things and remembering what it's like to being in the classroom. And to be perfectly honest, I'm not sure the phone is the greatest thing in the world because you're not necessarily as a teacher thinking about that and answering, where if you hear on the PA
So
system.
most your IP phones, you don't have to pick up the phone. And that's something that Mr. Graham can look into for the software, but it activates the phone. So you don't have, it's a paging system essentially.
Is that,
You are correct, but I can also tell you there are plenty of places in the high school. I'm thinking of the tech ed labs and other places where you will never hear the phone if it kicks on.
and the other part, kids are taught those codes too, so if they're in cafeteria,
Yeah, they would hear them with the IP phones.
I
in
don't
would
think
never
so in
hear
the
it.
cafeteria,
no
they would,
phone.
if they're in bathrooms, if they're in the hallways, there's no phones in the hallways, they wouldn't hear those.
How long's it been this way? Can I ask? You said, how long's it been this way? The way it is now? Like the system's working today.
It is.
How long's it been this way in the high school with what we just discussed? How many years?
The wiring and the original amps, some are still there, date to the nineties. The head-end unit that's there now, that
That's-
controls everything, we installed in the early 2010s.
That's not my question. I'm sorry. I rephrase it. Maybe I restate my question. My question is, there was mention about, oh, it can't be heard in the cafeteria. How long's it been that way? How many years?
That
No,
was,
with the
that was in
phone
relation to a
patch.
phone setup, not the paging system. You can hear the paging system in the cafeteria.
Okay. Okay. All right. I just want to make sure that I'm hearing things correctly. You're talking about the IP versus the current paging system, which is functional in the cafeteria.
Don't-
Okay.
I have just a technical question. I thought we had a school-wide messaging system through email and text messages. Like there was a way to push out messages to the entire community. Isn't that correct, Mrs. Burkholder? I'm sorry, I can't hear you.
Sign up for it. It's not to the entire.
Don't all of our students sign up for this?
The majority, not all of them.
Well, maybe they should be required to sign up for it, and that will give us another layer of redundancy.
It's not like I'm pretty sure most of our students have cell phone.
Yeah, like what percentage of the
But
students
not
in
all.
high school have cellular telephones? Probably greater than
Probably.
95%.
But you can't-
Probably.
So we cannot require students to sign up for that by law.
And they
They'd
haven't
have to
changed
voluntarily elect to do
Yeah,
that.
and
We actually just received information on that from a legal consortium regarding whether we can just automatically enroll and or have people voluntarily elect to receive those type of text messages. So they have to voluntarily elect it. We cannot auto enroll unless it's for a true emergency.
Isn't that what we're talking
So-
about?
But we would
No.
have to
Aren't we
get,
talking about,
So
that this is an emergency
Right.
communication system?
but we could do that for staff and for parents who we have numbers for, but we can't, if we don't have the students' phone numbers. Again, where's a workaround
How
for
can
that?
we not have our students' phone numbers?
Because we don't call the students, we call their parents or guardians.
Okay.
So
Guess I come
I
back.
never
we
heard of
can-
not having your students' phone numbers, but I don't want to go down a rabbit hole here.
I don't want to stifle the discussion, but we just need to we need to get to a point where we can give a recommendation as whether this board wants an RFP on this or not. So what is the consensus of the group, or do we need to do a straw poll?
Take a vote.
We can't really vote on it. It's not really a voting item, but we can do a straw poll.
I'd certainly like to hear from Mr. Gleason on this as well, if he can chime in on it, on his perspective on,
Is that
on the
emergency
safety.
system that we're hearing?
No, that's someone's phone, right?
Well, the other thing is too, I'm sorry.
that's
Was that the
somebody's,
demo?
that's
of the
somebody's
emergency
personal
system?
phone.
Someone's personal phone.
that was just someone's phone.
Right, so it works, the system.
But
That's not our
the
system.
That's just. the phone.
Oh, I thought someone was actually showing like how the system works. Okay.
The other thing is, we don't need to even make any decision tonight. I mean, this is an unbudgeted item. It came to us kind of out of the blue. So I would suggest that, if we're not ready to make a decision about this tonight, and you want to hear from Mr. Gleason and you need time to think about it, we can surely table it for another meeting. I don't know if this belongs on finance or facilities because it impacts both. But at the end of the day, we can put it on for another meeting for further discussion, and maybe that's the right thing to do. How does the group feel about tabling this till the next finance facilities committee meeting?
I'm fine with that.
It's a safety issue. I'm not, I truly believe it is a safety issue. I was hoping to hear from Mr. Gleason so that others might better appreciate it that way.
Mr.
However, I am not,
Here.
I'm not comfortable. I know. So I'm just saying I would rather proceed than table it for that discussion. That would be my personal.
Is there an imminent threat to student safety?
No.
The day it
No.
doesn't work.
Is there currently an imminent threat to student
If
safety?
it dies, which I can't promise it won't, and we don't have parts, there's no announcements in the building. There are no notifications of lockdowns if someone pushes the button.
But
The
I'll.
system is currently working, correct, Mr. Graham? Okay, thank you.
And I'll tell you, I had the same thing at work and computer went down. And the system went down. So, and it was brand new within 3 months. And I lost all learning system in the building. So it can happen on any system.
Correct.
That's just how it is. And so I don't feel like it's an immediate safety concern. I'm not saying we shouldn't replace it. I'm not saying we should do whatever, but I think it's a budgetary thing. It's more discussion. I don't think it's an emergency that we do it now. It's currently working. And we can get parts to back it up.
Just so the board has all the information if you're considering it, and again, that's. Certainly, you're right. The situation was, we were actually unable to put our building into a hold to deal with the student situation. I don't want to get into the details of that, but we were unable to control our hallways because the pager didn't work. Now, whether it's because it's old, we needed to reset like my computer does every day, that's above my pay grade, but that was the safety concern. So I just want you to know, as we're assigning value to that safety concern, what we have and don't have. And again, it might go another 5 weeks and be perfect every day. That's just what we're currently working with. So we were unable to put our building into hold as a result of that page.
Maybe we need to better understand the rationale behind the reason that it failed as well.
The reality is, even if we did put an RFP out and get another one, it's gonna be how long from now till we get one?
There's no fast swap.
So probably not gonna be till after school's out anyway. That's a correct assumption? Okay, okay. So it's not something we're gonna imminently fix right now.
Yeah, so I'm going to suggest, since we don't really have consensus around this, that we put this on for April 30th. And those of you that need to have conversations with individuals, particularly Mrs. Brady, with Mr. Gleason, or whoever you need to talk to, and then we can discuss it again to decide if there's a desire to go out for RFP. In the meantime, maybe we can get a little additional information on the exact reasons for the failures. And I would ask that, based on this situation that's been referenced, that we understand exactly why. Was it because we were negligent in replacing things? I'm not suggesting we were. Was it because we didn't do an upgrade? Because we didn't do a refresh? Was it because we didn't properly plan with parts? I really need to know more details before I spend money that I know is going to get lost when we look at a project, or at least partially lost.
The other thing I would add is, how often is it breaking down? Is it?
You wouldn't know unless you're using it regularly. So like for some of those situations, you know,
Like, do we test it? Do we test it?
Yeah. the
How
pager
often?
is used every day.
Okay.
That's what
but you don't know when it's gonna go. There's no signs. It doesn't get staticky. And again, I am just making sure the board's informed. It is a lengthy process regardless, whatever we decide.
Yeah, so we test the system daily.
It gets used every day.
Okay. So the system is being used every day, so we're checking it every day and it's functional most of the time. I think to Mr. Garber's point, no matter what system you have, in the best circumstances, you could have potential failures. And I need to know a lot more again before I would even get close to being willing to commit dollars towards something like this. And I feel like this isn't anything new. And so these things should be planned out and part of our capital budget. It feels like these surprises just show up, and I'm not trying to be critical. It's what's happening. And it's not the way we like to do business related to making decisions financially. So we need to have better planning.
Yes. Like, we agree on that.
Does anybody have any other
I'm sorry,
comments
I didn't
about
hear what
this?
Mrs. Eshelman said.
Okay.
He said we need better planning, and I said yes. So things like this don't occur. And we're,
Oh, I just didn't hear what you said.
in that
Thank you.
position.
Does anybody have any other comments or thoughts before we close this discussion and we move this to the next meeting so that you can gather any information you need?
Just one more quick thing. I just want to know if this system does go down and there's a hold, or even worse, there needs to be a lockdown, that there's information gets out to the kids if there's nothing there, if they're in, if they're in the cafeteria, they're in the gym where it's noisy,
There's not a great way to do that. What we've done in that situation was an email, but then try to call, but it's tough because normally then you have
right.
teachers check your email, but a lot of it's going to be a manual response at that point.
Which, so
Takes time.
so that's something we should probably look at for all the schools, because if we don't have a emergency backup for any school, doesn't matter what it is, it can go down. So that's a fair on our part for not having a backup
I would
for every
totally,
school.
I would
the
totally agree
district.
with that, because exactly the same, because again,
New system,
elementary
old system.
kids, they have cell phones, but they're kept in book bags and they're not allowed out at all, even with the middle school, so
Yeah.
that's not really an option.
All right, any other thoughts? All right, we'll close discussion on that. We'll have that added to the next meeting for review of the request for would we consider an RFP on the paging system? Let's go to the contracts, item D, 3D. We do have contract here. I don't know if anybody wants to address this. I don't think this is anything new. We've talked about it before. It's a renewal contract, if I have that right. And it will be on the agenda April 9th for approval. So now's the time to talk about anything surrounding this. If you have any questions, so that we can move forward with that on April 9th. All right, hearing no comments, that'll be on the agenda for the April 9th approval, and that concludes the Finance Committee meeting, as there are no action items. You want to move into buildings and grounds, or do you need a break?
Let's take a short break. Let's meet at quarter up.
All right, how many
7
minutes?
minutes.
All right, a little less than 10-minute break. Thank you.
so I'm just going to start talking. Welcome to our Buildings and Ground Committee meeting. Our first item on the agenda is removal of the underground oil tanks. I think Mrs. James going to give us an update.
Good evening. I just wanted to give you an update on the removal of the underground tanks. The oil tanks, if you recall, these are at Landisville Middle School and Landisville Primary Center. The tanks have been removed. They, the soil testing has gone out for testing. I can tell you that the experts told me that they have no concerns that there's going to be issues with the soil samples. They said that there's a distinct smell that they would have smelled when they opened up the tanks. That smell was not present. The tanks were not rusted, so they have no reason, as I had mentioned, they have no reason to believe that there are any issues with leakage from the tanks, but they are required as part of as part of the certification, they are required to send out soil samples. They have filled the holes back in with just dirt and stone at this point. So nothing has been, because we don't have the samples back yet, that takes about 2 weeks. But they have filled them back in. They cannot do the finishing touches on that. Now, all of this is ahead of schedule. So yay, that's a good thing. And, if you recall, with no removal of contaminated soil, we stand to get a change order credit back on that purchase order between the two buildings of $136,000. So that will be to our credit. There's also an area on there if they had to remove additional fuel oil from the tanks, which they did not. We had both of the tanks down below 500 gallons when they went to remove them. So they did not have to, and that's the lowest you can burn off of the fuel. So we had it burned off to that level. So there wasn't additional. So that may be, it's hard to say exactly how much that will be, but that could be reflective in about a $2,000 change order credit that we would also receive. So I can't say that's the exact amount, but that is good news that we are ahead of schedule on that. And were no signs of any contamination.
What does that bring the total cost down to?
You want me to do math? So,
Well, you can tell me the original cost. I can
the
do it
original-
myself.
1 second here. The original cost was
It was a little over
it was
400,000.
it was about 407, if I recall.
Okay,
correctly.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So we're going to be down to around
Yes.
270.
It was 407,184.
Thank you.
Mhm.
Any other questions on the underground oil tanks? Sounds like things went well. Okay, our next presentation is on the architect RFP. I believe you're going to be. Why don't you introduce yourselves? What's that? Yeah, go ahead.
Hello, good evening, everyone. And Dan Davia here, and hopefully everyone has had an opportunity to take a look at the draft RFP for architectural services in connection with the high school project. I've listened to a number of board meetings over the past several months, and in particular the dialogue and the hearty dialogue, and hopefully this has been crafted as a meaningful step in the right direction, necessary direction to get you a design professional who can be a critical component of a team that's going to get you the answers to all the questions you have, refine the options that are practical for you to then debate what you intend to do with the high school project. I'm happy to take any questions about it whatsoever. I just want to point out, it is specific to the high school. It's not a canned RFP. We do a good bit of this elsewhere. And, over the last 21 years, it is specific to the high school. I do want to point out, though, I have a revision to make. There is a tentative schedule in the RFP on page 2 that reflects it going out basically immediately, and then over the course of the next month or so, selecting a design professional. listening to the board, I think it's not going to be sufficient to just send out a good RFP, get 6 or so firms, I'm just saying on average to submit and sort of vet that all out and make it apples to apples. I think you're gonna, based on my understanding of the board, you're gonna want to reduce that down to a number of finalists, meet the particular individuals who'll be working from those firms and do some tours of some of their projects. That's just my gut feeling listening to you. If you don't care to do that, that's fine. We know all the firms, we work with them. We know the individuals within the firms, but you don't. So, anyway, with that as initial introduction, happy to answer any questions.
I guess one of my initial questions is, we're kind of all over the place and we have a number of different options. What is conceivably, I mean, we talked about the new high school, new Parcel High School. I mean, how many options are we looking at is feasible to do with the architect based on what you're proposing here?
So the process you're about to embark on is not novel. It's the typical process. I don't think you want to limit it to any number at this point.
Okay.
The way the RFP is written, it's to retain a design professional for the concept through schematic phase with a fee broken out to cover the rest of the project. I'm not suggesting that you abort or skip and try a new architectural firm and do another process. But again, listening specifically to this district, there's a lot of concern about what that project's going to look like. And concept is high level. You're a concept, like sub-concept now. Schematic is when you really have kind of married program, life cycle costing, hard construction costing. I believe John Michelle's on the line as well from our firm, but you can't make, I can visualize a day, a number of months from now, when you literally have all the answers to your questions you feel you have about the project, and it becomes an issue of, okay, here are our options. If I had to guess based on having done a lot of this, you're gonna pair off an option or two very quickly right away. And then you're gonna be left with something, again, this is my opinion, it means nothing. You said you're one of 9. I'm nobody, I'm just we're facilitators. But having done this a lot, you're gonna see very quickly our options financially, practically speaking, are in a relative area. I'm gonna guess they're gonna be you'll get concepts back initially, and you'll see them frankly from our current option 1 through a new building. Initially in the concept phase, you'll see those options with revised cost, with corresponding pros and cons for each of those options. I envision you then passing judgment at some point. Okay, based on what we're hearing, based on this additional information we have, we now want you to narrow it down and look more closely at
That's
these
where you
options.
go to the schematic phase, is that right?
Correct.
Can you explain for all of our board members, because they might not understand what that means, and I want to make sure I understand what what we would get in the concept phase and what we would get in the schematic phase, to help them understand because you say concept and
Sure.
schematic, I'm not sure all the board members know what that means.
Sure, in the typical design process, and it's you can substitute some of the words, but it's pretty uniform. You have concept, which is literally where we are now, and we're kind of below concept right now. We're really high level or low level, if you want to look at it
It's
that
going to be
way.
narrowed down a little bit more than it is now, concept.
Yes,
Okay.
yes. And I would expect in that, so you'll have line diagrams, similar, no, you haven't seen line diagrams. So for example, one of the options where we talked about eliminating, preserving a part of the building and renovating it, maybe eliminating some other portions, you'll see line drawings that reflect these options with concept cost and pros and cons. Then you'll practically narrow that down and then enter schematic phase on most likely fewer of those options. At the schematic phase, now you're taking your design to a higher level. You're essentially the heavy cost of a design professional is when you get the design development. That's when you're like initially, for example, you have your engineers, your sub-consultants involved in the concept phase, but the heavy lifting is, okay, now as a district, this is the option we want. This is the budget and the pros and cons that we feel most comfortable with. Now go deliver on that. Keep us within that budget. Keep,
budget's established in the concept phase, the schematic would further fine tune that?
you have your budgets now for the 6 phases.
Understood.
That'll get refined more in concept. And again, I would expect at that level, once the concept is presented to you, those various options with cost, you'll make an educated decision and narrow it down further. Then we'll come back to you at the end of the schematic phase. And that'll be basically, here's our remaining options, here's our costs, give us the marching orders, which project you want to move forward on. And then again, the meat of the design effort and the cost of the design professional and the time is going to be in the design development, which would be your next phase. And that's where you really get all your sub-consultants, your engineers involved. You do all your investigative work. You basically take what you've agreed to in schematic and then spend, it's usually like bi-weekly meetings, you keep meeting with design professional, owners rep, members of the district, and you keep honing that process, keeping in mind the budget that you've established in schematic, the scope that you've established in schematic, and a schedule as well.
The schematics could still have a couple options left. It might not just be one, or would it be narrowed down to an option?
No, like I said, dollars to donuts, you probably are gonna, after concept, you're gonna see, I think responsibly, we need to come back to you with some package that reflects everything from the bare bones to a new build. And then you make the decision. We're not doing maybe both of those or whatever you're going to make a decision on, but it'll be based on more information than we have right now. It'll be based on pros and cons, programmatic, cost, life cycle. You'll have all the information. But then when you get the schematic, so you'll authorize perhaps,
Schematic will be which option we pick.
right. And then at that point, the table is kind of set. Everyone's marching. You're spending the time and energy to now turn that schematic. This is the project we want. We've heard the pros and cons. This is the budget that we feel comfortable with, and a schedule and a deliverable that our community supports, that we support. Now make it happen and stick to those numbers. There's always that scope creep that happens in the design process. That's part of the responsibility of the team to not have that scope creep. In the event that there is something, we do some investigative work down the road or something happens, that'll be that's kind of our accountability to come back to the district and discuss. And as far as the reporting, it's as often as you want. Some districts don't want to even hear about it. It's something that's done behind the scenes. Show us the project and we'll approve it before it goes out to bid. Other districts have people involved with the admin, even at the board level on bi-weekly meetings. So that's tailored to your need.
So when you say schematic, what would we actually see on the display or have in our hands? Pictures of what the building.
So by the time you get the schematic, let's say for argument's sake, in concept phase, you have 5 or 6 options, and then you authorize 2 or 3 to go into schematic.
Okay.
Then by the time, when you choose a design and schematic to move forward with to the end, at that point, you'll have much better line drawings. You should have a 3D rendering a model that can be put on the screen that'll show you, really frankly, you'll see most of the architects can give you a model that shows, someone walking in the building and how the building flows, what the outside of the building looks like. You'll have much deeper costing.
Okay.
And those pros and cons will be further articulated.
So after the schematic is a detailed design, which actually would go to build the building. Is that correct? Or is there another step in there?
After design development, the last phase is construction documents.
Okay. The design.
Those are the
development-
typical phases: concept, schematic, design development, and then construction. Construction documents is usually like a 2-3 month process at the end. At that point, it's dotting i's and crossing t's for the most part.
At what point will you conduct, or the engineering firms conduct, sort of site surveys to determine, what land we are sitting on that could even, open land, can it even potentially be built?
Concept. concept, what needs to happen in concept is you also have to identify all your risks and exposures. Might they be schedule with approvals? Might they be, underground issues with water? Or, the idea is to identify, because as part of the presentation of the concept budget is an inclusion of project contingency or the design contingency for change orders and soft costs. In order to have an accurate picture and move forward from concept to schematic, you need to know your risks. Otherwise, the information is not meaningful.
So do I understand then that they wouldn't even present concepts 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6? If one of those, they wouldn't be presenting a concept that couldn't be physically put on that land area? Or would they not research that until after concepts are selected?
It would be irresponsible to present something that couldn't be done.
Okay, so they would do all the land surveys before giving us a concept option?
Yes.
Okay.
I guess that is, because you've mentioned before about, like, we have the problem with the pack with the pumps running in the water fields and stuff. I'm thinking, well, it might be just the example, the hybrid option with expanding the building. Well, we could all think that's the greatest thing in the world, but if you find out, well, yeah, we can expand the building if we're going to put it on pontoons for the addition thing because it's feasibly impossible because of the water.
Like,
So when will
so
that?
for example, on that point, we've heard over and over again about the underground water, and you're not the only one that has that. I mean, we've done other projects close by that have that as well. Manhattan Township's high school for one. That investigative work should be done, and again, the district has made this very apparent. That should be done in the concept phase. But in comparison, if we're going to if the decision is to keep portions of the building, we would want to scope the underground piping within the building to determine whether or not it can remain or needs to be replaced in whole or in part. That maybe we put a placeholder in the budget for that, but that might be done a little further down.
I guess
There's no sense in spending the money to investigate the pipes in the building on something that could be, we could liquidate and put in a budget value
Right.
for, if you don't even choose that option in schematic.
Yeah.
So,
Well, I was just more concerned about the underground water because I'm thinking,
yeah, I think
That
that's a
could be
big item. We've
big
been hearing about that.
but that would be done initially when we get okay.
When you get the first round of options after
Yeah, I mean,
concept.
even, at least the proposal of building a new high school across the street, I assume it would be the same problems with it. Be nice, if we voted for that, but can't build it because it's just not possible.
I'm just going to take us back to the RFP, which is really what's on the agenda. I mean, we could go down these rabbit holes about all these other things, and it's good discussion, but I do have a question specific to the RFP. Is the timeline to receive the responses that's listed in here an appropriate timeline of April 17th? Does that give us enough time to get the proper number of individuals contacted, which I'm assuming you will contact people directly, and contact everyone that we need to contact to make sure they have an opportunity? Because there's a lot of details in here surrounding what more maybe than I'm what maybe used to seeing in RFP. It depends what it is, but some responsibilities of them. Does that truly give them enough time to do that? Or is that going to limit our number of people that participate because of some of the things in this RFP? What's your thoughts on that?
So we've already spoken to most of the firms, well, definitely all the
Okay.
firms geographically within that are in this marketplace within like a 30-40 mile radius.
Okay.
And we've had other firms outside of the
Okay.
race have already contacted us, not that we've contacted. So the project's sort of out on the street already.
Okay,
And now,
that's
however, just listening to the board, I think the board, and again, this is my opinion, I think the board would have more comfort listening to the board with my expectations will get 5 or more proposals, quality proposals.
Mhm.
But my feeling is the board is going to want to narrow that down and then go see some of the projects, meet with the people. That's just a gut feeling. If you,
No, I
some
think
school
it's
districts
fair.
have no interest in that, they just delegated it. Okay.
No, I think that's fair. I think there'll be some people on this board that may want to be part of that and may want to narrow that down and see some of their projects. It may depend on who those finalists are too, and the comfort level, and our experience with some of those firms potentially outside of these walls. So some people may be having none, others of us having worked with some of them in the private sector. So
Our goal after the RFP process, and again, it's not abnormal for a board member or two to sit on those interviews, but our goal would be by the time we sat for those interviews, we would have a matrix that would compare apples to apples, the firms that submitted.
I do like the aggressive timeline, frankly, because it keeps this project moving. So
That's our
I just
nature,
don't want
but
it to be too aggressive, but I actually like the fact that we're not sitting on our hands and that we're not out another few months until we conduct interviews. I mean, this is all in April where we're pushing through this fairly quickly. And I don't think that's a bad thing as long as we don't get ahead of ourselves and trip.
what I would recommend as to, in response, so with your permission, it goes out on the street. If we get pushback, which is common, like, for example, when you put construction documents out, if we get pushback from the marketplace that's saying, no, we need a little more,"
aggressive.
we'll listen to that and we'll come
Yeah.
back and we'll
Okay.
work something out. Perhaps if you're okay with the schedule, and perhaps if we don't get pushback from the marketplace, maybe we can incorporate the tours somewhere in there without having to push it out much.
No, I like the aggressive nature of it. My final question, then I'll be good, is just, is it commonplace that the district has a positive experience working relationship with the engineering firm and the civil engineering firm? Did you normally put that in there? Is that gonna be, is that a good thing? I mean, I guess you don't need to answer if I'm politically not correct, but I guess my question is that okay, I guess, to put that in there?
It is. I mean, you'll
Okay.
notice on the last page, there's a basically this is
Okay.
professional services. You have no obligation
Sure.
to competitively go after this,
Okay.
and you could cancel the whole thing if you choose to.
Mm.
I will say that it's in here, but in reality, even if it wasn't in here, typically the design professionals will contact the
Well,
district.
ask.
Who do you like working with?
Okay,
Yeah.
that's fair. That's what I thought you might say. Thank
So-
you.
I did have a question. So like we did previously when we hired the architect to do the feasibility study, would this be the committee members would meet with these three or four firms when they narrow it down? Is that kind of what you guys were thinking?
Same process. we
So
used
the
earlier.
buildings and ground, which would be Judy, myself, Justin, and I think someone said Richard may
Johnson.
come on to the committee.
I believe it's Mrs. Johnston. but
He is on the, so it'll be Richard. So the four of us,
I believe it's Mrs. Johnston on the committee.
Either way, I agree with you, Mr. Maris. That's typically how it would work.
yeah, okay. That's fine.
I'll start off with, I have some big concerns about this RFP, and I'm probably not the popular one, but it looks like we're doing a feasibility study all over again, right? The feasibility study.
No.
Well, we spent a lot of money doing a feasibility study, half feasibility study, right? And I know.
Two of them.
Right, we spent a lot of money, and now we're spending money again because we didn't address what the foundations like, what the waterways like, what the ground surveys like, all that stuff. That could have all been already done, so now we're redoing it. The other thing that's challenging in this RFP is I know for a fact, when you give architects a blank slate, they're gonna build Taj Mahal, because they get paid by the square footage. And without giving them direction, it's hard to reel an architect back in.
I
Because
think,
what's gonna happen is you're gonna build a building, they're gonna put an architect, and you're gonna catch a couple things, but not catch the other 10 things. And so we gave them a blank slate to say, we have 6 options, or whatever you feel like is best. Your professional thing. So we have left the door wide open, and once the horse is out of the barn, it's hard to get it back in. So I have concerns about how wide this RFP is and how there's no direction for this team. I also know that a lot of your good construction companies that aren't looking for work are gonna say, you know what, this is too much work for this RFP. You're asking too much stuff all over the place. It's not worth my time, because I have plenty of work.
You're talking contractors now.
Well, no, even architects, they're good architects that don't need work. There's a lot of stuff in here, and they're not, for 3 weeks to try to bid it out, they're gonna say, you know what? I don't need this business. I'm gonna go somewhere else.
I can just say that, just kind of, just out in the public, and I'm sure you have a response to this, Mr. Garber, that they want this business and they're hungry for it. And there are some good ones that are very hungry for this work. And I can also tell you that there are good people that understand the balance between a new building versus a renovation, and they will come at it from that direction. I think when we choose an architectural firm, and I'll be as bold to say this, a lot of it comes down to the character of those people that you're working with within that firm and their understanding of our desires related to that. So I would probably disagree with you on a few of these things just from what I know. And I would say that there are going to be people out there that will give us honest options around a remodel versus a rebuild, which I think is where your concern is.
I-
And I really believe we can get an architecture firm that won't just push for the highest dollar amount related to this, but really does care enough that they'll give us a fair perspective of what that looks like and the pros and cons.
I'm concerned that we have no goals and plans, like I talked about
Well-
in the meeting. We have no, what's our objective? What's the reason what we're trying to do? Is it classrooms? Is it more classrooms? So without giving that information, we're gonna run up these costs very quickly. Because the
Well,
architect
if I
gonna
could say
sit-
something, and I think Dan's probably gonna say this, but we're gonna get into the phase where we have input as a board and as an administration. This isn't just gonna be schematic phase, here you go, guys,
I understand.
300 million.
I
I
got,
think we're gonna have input. Is that correct, Dan?
It is. I have more response as well, but it is, of course.
but the problem is if I'm an architect and I have to bid out a project and I have to do 4 plans and redo it again and again, the price is gonna keep going up. We have to have a clear goal and objective before you even start this, because we want to limit our costs. So why would we not start with a smaller scope than this huge scope? Because it limits our costs. They're gonna charge us more for the more times we
But I don't
make
think,
modifications.
I don't think we know what we want and we have
That's
to
the problem.
fine tune
But
it.
then we
And that's the
cut-
problem.
But
but
we
it-
do,
we cut
I
off-
think it's something between option 1 and option 6. It's somewhere in there.
What are we trying to fix?
I
Trying to
just,
fix an old high school.
Let me offer a suggestion, because I think Mr. Garber makes a good point here. Would it work to put in the RFP not a desired not to exceed cost for each option?
There is a range
No,
in
I
here.
don't know if that works. I don't know if that's possible. Like, we don't want to spend more than $70 million.
do you know that?
What?
Do you know that?
Well,
We
we
don't,
based
because
on
we
the
don't know the
data and
goal.
the feasibility study.
To address Mr. Garber's concern, I respect those concerns. And Mr. Vogelman's comments about the firms in the field. There are some firms that are busy regardless. They're not going to look at this project because they're too busy and they don't have the manpower. That's germane to every industry and, out there. But I do feel, that the project is large enough and there's enough firms, quality firms locally, that you're going to get good competition. The way the fees broke down, you're going to see that competitiveness in the fee. Where the project gets established and where the bulk of that architectural fee
Is
is
later.
spent is after you choose your project.
Mhm.
So
But we're talking the difference between hundreds of $1,000s and millions of dollars. It's still gonna be, it's not gonna be $10,000 in the beginning phase. We're talking hundreds of $1,000s in the beginning phase.
yeah, again, we do a lot of this.
I
If
understand.
if you were more settled on an option right now, you could steer the RFP in that direction. Listening to you.
Yeah, but-
I don't see you being there.
Right,
No,
and
we're
that's-
not
I'm
settled.
more addressing that to the board because we are here and we need to be here. And we're gonna waste a lot of money because we're here. And it's gonna slow down the process because we're gonna have to go to the architect and we're gonna make changes. Then he's gonna come back 3 weeks later and we're gonna make changes. Or we're gonna have more debate about it when we can just decide we're going to, here's the priorities. I wanna fix classroom size. I wanna fix hallways. I wanna fix the infrastructure. Here's our parameters, fix this problem instead of just go.
If I could throw two quick responses. One is, we would expect once our firm is retained to be biweekly meetings.
Mhm.
And then also what's customary, again, it's a board decision, but it's customary to go out to the public and gather that input before you pick your option
Right.
and spend all the money to proceed down that path. So again, I just don't think you're there. And I don't know financially if there's any harm in any way, the way it's written. If anything, I think it's broken out. We would normally, I mean, this is kind of our firm's thing. There's no commitment to go past the schematic phase, the way this will be set up. So the firms who go after it, their incentive is to get there as quickly as possible. That's going to be a natural, tug of war, because they're going to want to get to that point, get you satisfied as quickly as possible, which is a good thing, right?
Mhm.
We want that to happen. But again, there's no commitment to continue on with them. So, and again, the biweekly meetings, I think you're going to be comfortable with it. Again, having done this a lot, and the firms that are going to go after this, you're not going to get firms that you're not going to look at them if they don't have a good a book of a proven high school experience. So you're going to get the firms that know high schools, know programmatically what's important to high schools.
But we also have agreed on the board, there's a lot of, we've been all the high schools and I get to other states and see stuff. There's a lot of poorly designed high schools. And we know that. So why we start there, I always just try to put the horse before the cart, not the cart before the horse. And I really feel like we're putting the cart before the horse.
Then what do you propose?
We need,
I-
the board need to figure out.
I disagree.
I disagree.
I don't think
know you
we,
guys do.
this is typically how the process has to work because we need this information to make wise decisions. I don't see how we do it any other way. I've not been part of any projects inside the school district or outside where you don't follow this process. And I'm not suggesting you do it the way you've always done it, but there's not a way to come with a recommendation that's so specific that we can tell an architect, this is what we want you to design and work up without looking at all these options, because the price range is in here, Mr. Keener, but the goal would be to be able to look at all these and then then you get into the weeds of the discussion with the architect and you talk about where you want to be financially and what you need and what you want. And that's where the work begins and that's where the costs begin. It's not in choosing an architect based on this initial phase. There's not, in the big scheme of things, there's not a lot of dollars built into this part of it. And a lot of them want the business. And so they're not going to come at this with huge costs to the district, if I'm correct in saying that. I
We're
feel pretty
talking about-
comfortable with this
I don't,
process.
and I don't think spending the money for the architect when you're talking $200 million is wasted money. I think the additional details is going to help us better come to a decision of board. It's too much out there. I think personally, I think the numbers right now we have are inflated. And in answer to you, Mr. Keener, I think when we get down to an option we select, we can say, we don't want to spend, this is how much we want to spend. And we can pursue that avenue so that it doesn't come out 100 million more than we can afford.
Yeah, I appreciate that aggressive timeline so that the committee, the Buildings and Grounds Committee, can get that information and get to work. I think that's really valuable.
To address your concern, we can modify the RFP to communicate the districts, like, rather than simply say concept and schematic, we can articulate the district's position is to get to the point of selecting an option as quickly as possible. We can sort of,
So, yeah, it kind of goes off this, because I asked the high school principal, and this is kind of administration, I haven't heard from administration what they want to, this is a board push, right? But I asked the high school principal what his vision is. He said, I was the first person to ever ask him that question. I don't know if that's true or not, I don't know, but that.
Mr. Garber, I'm having
concerns me.
trouble hearing you. You're not
So I
talking to
said-
your microphone.
Said it concerns me. I asked the high school principal what he would want or vision for the school, like what his priorities, what's his goals. He did not have an answer for him. He said, I was the first person to ask him that question. So we are not talking to our administration. We're not talking to our people. It's the board's push. And I want to make sure that we're using our dollars appropriately. And let's, as a board, come together and figure out.
Wouldn't they
before-
be
That's
involved though? in those
I'm not trying to be offensive, but that does come much later in the project. And then they're
That's-
all involved,
yeah,
even
that's-
down to the
what I'm
teachers
saying,
and
yeah.
support staff and everyone. We aren't even close to that yet, but they will be directly involved in everything.
Mr. Waldwood, I see your point, but Mr. Garber makes a good point as well. If the high school principal doesn't have a vision for what the high school should look like, maybe we are moving too quickly here.
I'm not sure that's what he said. He
No.
didn't say that the principal doesn't have a vision. He said that nobody has asked him.
But-
No.
for it.
But he had feedback, but my thing is if the board does not have a plan, no one has asked him why we need a new high school. Or I shouldn't say, nobody's asked him what he would like to fix in a new high school. So if we haven't looked as a board and as a administration and come to a consensus of what are we trying to do, I don't want to just spend money to fix an old building.
if I may, you're not going to be able to get to that point without the design professional at the table as part of a shepherding process about here's our options, here's the world of possibilities, programmatically, design-wise, et cetera. To me, listening to you, I'm comfortable modifying the RFP instead of just saying.
Well, I'm just one of 9, and I'm no.
No, but I respect your point of view.
I'm out on the outside, I get it.
No, but like, I think we're going to get competition from firms, but the concern about spending the money up front, if we revise this, I'm perfectly comfortable doing it. Instead of just saying concept schematic, make it more articulating to the point of getting the district, presenting initial options, forget about concept schematic, but just shepherding the options to the point that the district is able to select an option to then move into schematic phase with the understanding that we've got, responsible cost and the options vetted. I think it could be, my point is, I think it could be worded to alleviate your concern a little more than it is right now. But
I also-
you can't do this without a design professional at the table. You can't.
I also don't want to rush this, and I want to take enough time so that we do it right. So if you're gonna, I don't want you to speed it up to try to get to the option. I want to make sure we give due
It won't be a
diligence.
speed up. It'll be a reflection of the district's wishes, not as the time, but it'll get the point across that we're not looking to spend a lot of money. We're looking to spend as much money as necessary to get us to the point of a project that we feel good about moving forward with.
And I appreciate your willingness to put that in there, but I think you stated it earlier. Their goal is the same as ours. It's kind of stating the obvious, but it's okay if you want to add it.
I just think, I hear the concern. It's a valid concern, and I think it doesn't take away anything, and I think it adds value to the RFP.
So are we okay moving this forward? I know I'm a chair of this committee, but I think we're back to this RFP. Are we comfortable moving this forward as a general rule? I mean, I am, so I'll just put that out there. I think I'm ready to go with this. Getting this RFP out there and getting some people to the table is the next step.
Like I said, I am, because I'm excited for the committee to then get to work on it and to get to those levels of, specifics that we want to get to that we can't get to right now. I think it's.
I did have one general question, which does relate to the RFP. Timing wise, you have a timing here to select, but from now until we're
Shovel in the ground?
No, yeah, well, yeah, now till construction drawings. If we're gonna have to deliberate some, and it's not gonna be overnight to make this decision, but when could we potentially have a proposed project and design in front of us to go borrow money for? How long from now? It's what, March?
What question
March
are you asking?
26th?
What question are you asking? Shovel in
I'm
the
asking-
ground or?
No, I'm not asking when it completed, but how long to get through this process to where we have construction drawings and we're ready to build?
It's gonna depend on us. I mean, I don't mean to steal your thunder, but
Understood.
that's a loaded question that I don't think anybody could
It's not-
answer.
There's some clarity there. So I think you can get to the point of selecting the option to move forward, that you can all feel we've been heard, we have the information we need to make a decision based on finance. I think you can get to that point in probably about, I'll say 4 months, 3-4 months.
Okay.
I have in my notes from the last committee meeting in March.
And I'm sorry, that's not from now. That's
Yeah.
from the point you retained the firm.
Understood. That's the schematic point, right?
Let's say to the point that you've chosen a option. Here's our budget, here's our schedule, here's our scope. I'm sorry.
No, it's okay. I just feel like I have, like, from last committee meeting, like a lot of the scheduling, the timeline kind of stuff. I think this is the step we need to take.
And you're not, I thought you wanted to go there. I would at least figure a year
12 months.
before you put a shovel in the ground from the moment you retain an architect, and that's probably conservative because we
Right.
don't know the approvals that we need at this point. Those would be articulated and before you select an option. Again, when you eventually get to the point, 3-4 months of selecting an option, you'll have all your pros, cons, risks, schedule, you'll have that all as part of the presentation.
Okay, any further questions for Dan? Anyone else? Anyone that hasn't spoken that wants to say something? All right.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dan.
Thank you.
All right, our next item on the agenda is feasibility study update. I don't know, is that you, Dan, also?
No, that's good. That's going to be me tonight. This is Chris
Oh, Chris,
online.
you're online? Okay.
Yes, sir. Good evening. So, yes, we wanted to come back with our March update on the work that's been done with the feasibility study and where we are today and where we believe we're going over the next 30 to 60 days. So there's a document we put
Chris,
together.
I'm sorry, we can't see you.
Oh, I'm sorry. It says I can't use video right now. I don't know if that can be.
We don't need to see you, Chris. It's all good.
Yeah, you're probably better off that way. No, I'm kidding. So, as
Chris, do you
far,
want to show the slide that the page that you're referring to right now?
Mr. Graham will be projecting it. Mike, if you can
Okay.
start with the updated
There he is.
Enfield Capital Project.
hello, good evening. Yeah, if you could show it should be the project update, with step 1 through 4. There we go. Perfect. Sorry about that. Thank you. So, since the last meeting in February, we wanted to provide an update. We've been working diligently to take, the study of priority 1s and 2s and start to pare them down as we discussed last month. And just to give you kind of a snapshot of where we were in February and where we are as of today, with still work to be done leading into the meeting on April 30th. But again, this just gives you kind of a snapshot of where we were and where we are from a cost perspective. Note on this sheet that there are HVAC items still currently being reviewed, and Train is involved with reviewing some of those items. So from where we are today to where we're going to go on April 30th, which we're going to talk about in a second, there's going to be obviously adjustments to some of the items we discussed tonight. So we just wanted to make sure that the board understood kind of where we are today, and there'll be some fluctuation and change between now and April 30th. If we could go to step 2, just so we can go through what we're proposing, and where you're going to start to see a transition, which the board has been discussing for the last couple months around the feasibility study and where to go. So in April, what you're going to see, and we're going to show a spreadsheet in a minute to give you an idea of where we're going, is an updated recommended capital projects list for the next 1 to 3 years based on this pared down study. And what you're going to see next month is an updated list that's going to transition from the Breslin study costing that there's been a lot of conversation about in prior meetings to market-based estimates that John will be doing with itemized contingency percentages. So we're going to be able to go building by building, item by item next month, and look at market-driven costs and contingencies based on what John sees in the market, what the estimating would be done. It's to give us, kind of that opportunity to really dialogue over an active list with current market-based costing for the board to review. We're also going to provide next month a summary of the projects that have been completed or scheduled for this coming summer. So there's been a lot of work that's been done. The board has approved these projects in multiple board meetings. We're going to bring a summary forward just to kind of encapsulate that so you can see everything that's been approved and what's going to be happening this summer as well. Once we get through the April conversation and review, what we anticipate in May is that we would have to come back because there's going to be a lot of dialogue with responses to questions, potential requests you may have as a board for additional information that you would want to see from our team, and we could have those additional discussions. If we can get to that point, we may start having some discussion on possible what procurement would look like, how projects could potentially be packaged for economic efficiency, and potentially start looking at schedules of potential bucketed projects over the next 1 to 3 years that you would obviously have to review, weigh in on, and then obviously a goal would be ultimately to approve the approval of projects starting to move forward for future years. As you know, we're heading into the summer of 2024. You have projects that are already locked in. And again, we're going to talk more about those next month. Really, where we're going to start to go is how do we plan for these future years proactively? How do we start to put projects together that the board's comfortable with strong market-based estimated costs that we can really start planning for the future? And once we start going through that process, and our hope is collaboratively, we can develop a schedule that, the board obviously would approve and that we're comfortable with. The work doesn't stop there as we move into these further months. Then it's starting to look at, what are some of the other priorities that may have been 3 and 4 that we need to start looking at maybe for 3 to 5 years down the road. So I just wanted to reiterate the process from a capital planning perspective doesn't stop. It needs to continue. The conversation you all had tonight around, finance and tax and all those pieces, while you're still deciding on a major project at Hempfield High School, all has to continue, and they have to be done kind of in parallel. So that way, everyone's comfortable with the decisions that are being made moving forward. So this is just, again, a short outline. Just wanted to, have the opportunity to kind of talk through this, make sure there were no major, no objections to where we're looking to go over the next 30 to 60 days. But I just want to, again, stress in April, to me, will be that pivot point that I believe from prior meetings and listening to the board of where you really wanted to get to make decisions and look at costs for capital needs that really need to be addressed in the next 1 to 3 years at the we'll call it the K-8 buildings, not the high school. Obviously, the high school will be handled through the RFP process that was discussed earlier. I'd like to pause there and just take any questions before we would flip to the next document, which would be just the sample spreadsheet that I was going to discuss for a minute or two.
Chris, this is Charles Maris. Could you go to Mike, could you go to the first page? Previous slide. I just want to point out to everyone, look at the initial 57.6 million without contingency is down to 27.9 million. So this, when I talked about preliminary costs sometimes being inflated, there's a good example. And they're still working on reviewing these and maybe even reducing the cost more.
No, it definitely has dropped. Some of that, obviously, we took items that maybe we didn't believe were a true priority at this point, which reduced the cost. I will caution you, because there's some MEP numbers that are not in these numbers tonight. You may see, you could see fluctuation down. You could see some fluctuation up once we have some of the additional MEP numbers. But I think what you'll have is a roadmap to make decisions on how you bucket projects and how recommendations can be made for these capital needs over the next 1 to 3 years. You're kind of married to the fiscal situation, the capital budget funds that are available. You can really start to roadmap and look at projects and where you want to go over the next couple of years. So I guess I was talking to the administrative team. It's like we're getting close to where I think the board wanted to be with the data to make the decisions on some of these other capital needs aside of the high school.
And I'd also point out that this is where Fidavia can help us a lot. They're working for us. And as we get into the RFP and the bigger architect, not the bigger, but the architect for the high school, they're going to help us likewise to find out ways that we can cut costs and make things less expensive than maybe the architect initially presents to us. You had a question, Judy?
I do. Just, you had mentioned some things that you removed from the list that maybe you viewed differently as far as priority items. Is that just your own firm's reevaluation of what the Breslin study showed, and your analysis of that was that was not an urgency, or it was, to use a term used earlier tonight, the low-hanging fruit of where can we save money, even though it probably is a priority too? I'm not saying one is better than the other, just trying to get clarification on the thought process.
No, and it's a great question. And to answer the first part of the question, it was done in collaboration with the Hempfield team. I mean, for us to come in as a firm and make assumptions based on what is on paper would not be appropriate professionally. So it was really in collaboration. Obviously, yes, we had our opinions, we made recommendations, but we worked collaboratively with Ms. James and Mr. Baransky, and just to really look at this, at this point. The other thing that went into some of the reduction too is we tried to really pull out the projects that are in process. So some of the study had dollars associated with items that were either in process of being done now or will be done this summer. So some of the adjustments were also, the dollar adjustments also, you can point to that. What I would say is the bucket that we kind of honed in on really came down to your HVAC MEP, masonry, roofs, and some major, I would say, asphalt and those type of cement type repairs. I mean, that's really where if you wanted to bucket where we've headed, it's really those absolute needs, your building envelope and your MEP. Some of the other things we scaled off too they were smaller amounts that potentially could be handled even through an operating budget through the facilities and maintenance department year after year. So there wasn't just one component that went into those decisions. To answer your question, it was kind of multiple data points that led to kind of this pared down list that we have as of today. And again, in April, the plan is to go through this building by building, item by item, so that way we can have that very in-depth discussion to make sure the board's comfortable. If there's things that the board, feels that we should reconsider, obviously that's the process we would want to undertake.
Thank you.
And Chris, I would just add to that the items that we may have removed, so to speak, are not removed from needing to be done. They're simply pushed down on the list that there isn't the urgency that they have to be done immediately.
That is absolutely correct. So yes, we didn't delete them per se. We transitioned them to kind of a later capital planning process. It's not really immediate to the next 1 to 3 years.
I'm just gonna state the obvious at this point. And to be clear, this is not about Mrs. James or Mrs. Hall or anyone on our staff, but this is the third time we've seen this list. Every time the list has changed, and every time we've seen it, the so-called priorities have become lower priority than they were before. And it begs the question about how accurate Breslin's work was the first time. And it begs the question about how much can we trust this sort of data going forward when it seems as though every time we push back, the architects say, oh, that's actually not as important as we said it was the first time.
Well, keep in mind that Fidavia, their job is to scrutinize the architect and the
Right, and
construction
I
people
appreciate that.
and to find this kind of stuff. So
Right, I'm glad that they're doing it, but my point is, it doesn't sound like we can trust the architects.
Well, I think.
Yeah,
For all the reasons that you said, Mr. Mills.
I think in this particular piece, we were asked to go back and look at those things that were the priority 1s and 2s to determine what do we feel could be pushed back. And so that's what was done here. And while that was happening, Chris and John and Dan and the Fidavia team also then looked at current market pricing, which they're still working on to be able to bring that back. So Chris, do you want to jump to the next document just to show them kind of that preview?
Sure, that'd be great. Thank you. Okay. So, yeah, maybe a little hard to see. I know it's on the screen, but this is basically where we're heading for April 30th. And you'll see, you remember the large list from the Breslin study. We pared that down significantly. The items in blue are still things we need additional answers on as we move towards April 30th. But what I wanted to really point out on this sheet is to the right, you'll see the 2 columns we added. April 2024 cost estimate with contingency. What you're going to see populated there next month on this sheet is market-based costs for all these items. And it's also going to impact how we package the items together. So that is really the next step of the exercise for April 30th, is to have this list where we'll talk item by item, but you're going to have, instead of having the Breslin estimated costs, you're going to have cost estimating through John and the team at Fidavia, looking at market-driven costs based on items in some cases, and then some will be potentially projects that if we lump them together, what we believe the market would look like, financially for those to move forward. So this again tonight was just to give you a snapshot of, you remember the large document from the Breslin study. This is kind of where we've been heading the past 30 to 60 days. Again, at the request that we pare this down and really determine what the main priorities are for some of the, K-8 buildings.
Any further questions for Chris? All right, thank you, Chris. Appreciate your time.
Thank you. Have a good evening, everyone.
Next item on the agenda is a change order clarification. Mrs. James?
Yes. So as we've talked about in the past, last summer, we worked on the HVAC for Roarstown and Mountville. That job was not able to be completed last summer, as we had talked about, as I presented to you before, and it will be completed this summer. Now, Ainsworth, the company that it was doing the work, came back to me and had a change order that they wanted to present of additional costs that they felt as though they were going to incur because they didn't do the completion of the work last summer, and they're going to complete it this summer. That change order, part of that change order was reflective of things that they did not do. And so they are going to assume those costs at no additional cost to us. What they came back to was a change order of $15,326, which I explained to them was at no issue with the district. The district did not have anything to do with that. That was as a result of some 8 heat pump units, 6 to be exact at each of the buildings, so 12 total, that had to be reordered and did not arrive until later. So I went back to Train and I explained to them that this is no responsibility, there should not be a responsibility of the district. They agreed with me, and they have agreed to assume that change order cost. This is going to be run through the district, however, because we do have the contract with Ainsworth. So you'll see that it's going to be a wash, but you will see that change order going through the district funds, and then Train will reimburse the district.
So the 15,326 will pay up front, and then Train will, when we pay Train, we won't.
No, the Ainsworth is going to invoice us for that amount. And then as soon as we get that invoice, we're going to get payment from Train.
Okay. Any questions? I like that one.
I'll be glad for the extra parking at Mountville. It's crazy.
All right.
this
And I
is-
believe the last item on the agenda is also Mrs. James, East Petersburg Elementary Gaga Pit.
And just so everyone knows, you can't, the board doc site apparently is down. So
But
you-
Charles has a paper copy.
he has
so
paper copy,
I
paper good
don't. I-
backup.
It's up on the screen.
There
We're
we go.
good.
There we go.
Yes, but unfortunately, we don't have access to the agenda.
You have the agenda. You're good.
I'll just make a point that if we had paper.
There's
we'd be
extras
able to
on
see agenda,
Music
right?
stand over there.
I'm still opposed to paper.
You just keep us, no, rejected. You can't hold it.
So I just wanted to go over with all of you. This is a similar Gaga pit to what was purchased by the PTA at or PTO. Okay. At Farmdale Elementary School. This is the same one. The PTO at East Petersburg Elementary is looking to purchase the same type of Gaga pit for East Petersburg Elementary. So what we would just be looking at here is the board to accept the donation of the Gaga pit.
I move that we accept the donation of the pit.
We're not voting on it, I don't think,
Okay.
but yeah, I don't think there's probably going to be any objection to that.
Okay. Any questions on the Gaga Pit? All right, there are no building and grounds action items.
One quick question. Sorry, guys, as it relates to the Gaga Pit. I just, and I don't want to bring up anything that's sensitive or old. We talk a lot about consistency across buildings. I remember a few years ago, I think it was Mountville, did they put in like a pavilion with like a concrete slab for people to sit at? I mean, like, I think if I'm remembering correctly.
Correct.
Yeah, I mean, can we just speak to the consistency or lack thereof as it relates to things that are accepted or not accepted as donations across various schools? Because there are some elementary schools and some schools across our district that say things like, hey, we can't accept this because other schools don't have it. And then other schools go ahead and say, yep, we're going to do it. It's not a huge deal. It's not the end of the world, but I think it's worth noting that this happens all the time, right? Where you have some schools and some kids and some faculty and staff that get things because they're donated or because they're built and they're accepted. And then you have others that don't get those same things even when they're presented to be donated. Again, not the end of the world, not a huge deal, but it's something that I wanted to make note of and bring up because I can tell you that there are some schools that just won't accept donations like this because other buildings don't have. Can we speak to that for a second?
Yeah, so the donations, if they're coming from a PTO, typically the PTO would work with the principal who would contact Mrs. James and Mrs. Hall. And then based on what it is, for example, like the Gaga pit here, that has been consistent as PTOs and or individuals working on an Eagle Scout, badge, et cetera, would bring to the board for approval. So anytime there's any type of addition or something that's being added in some way, shape, or form to the grounds of the school has to come through Buildings and Grounds and then ultimately to the school board for approval.
I would hope it would even give PTOs other ideas to spend their money. Like if this is a hit at East Pete, my kids at Centerville might be like, hey, PTO, let's get a Gaga pit, like it breeds like, I think ideas too, which is really.
Yeah, we have the Gaga pits now are at Farmdale, Mountville, LIC, and potentially East Pete moving forward.
Correct.
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, regardless, my motion was not seconded, so I guess we're not accepting the donation. So I mean,
It will
It's
be
not
on
up for
April-
vote.
we can do it. I mean.
It's
without-
not an action item. We can approve it at the board meeting, correct?
Correct. It'll be on the April 9th agenda. This is just informational for you to be aware so that we can then come back and.
But we still, as all of us know, we can take official action on any item at any meeting as long as it's on the agenda.
They don't even, they don't have it all
Right.
submitted
We
yet.
don't have all of that, which is
There's
why
no-
this is
no reason to
informational.
do
So
that.
April 9th, all of that will come back in play and we'll have everything we need.
All right. Any other discussion items? I have a motion to adjourn.
So
Second.
moved.
All right. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.